Remnant 2 has 225 rings as of the 3rd DLC. How do they compare against one another? Well, to answer that question, I've gone ahead and recreated a tier list design used by a certain DBD content creator. The layout and categories work well for describing a lot of the rings, and I recently got Adobe Illustrator, so I figured I'd seize the opportunity. And as a massive disclaimer, this list is formed entirely from my opinions and experiences playing Remnant 2. If you think I ranked something too low or too high, I highly encourage you to leave a comment down below. This video will more than likely spark the most discussion out of every topic I've covered, and I'm all for it. I'm always down to converse about video game balance. If you happen to be a fan of a ring I rate low, don't let that stop you from using it. On average, I like prioritizing fun over what is considered meta, and if using a certain ring brings you joy, more power to you. Before starting, it's important we go over each category and break down what the criteria is for a ring being placed in them. The top tier is excellent. Rings in the excellent category are the best of the best, the cream of the crop. These ones provide such a massive boost that they either make other options completely obsolete, or they're just that powerful in their effects. Below excellent is very good. Rings in the very good category are great picks for a variety of setups. They may have a few cons or requirements to get working, but their effects easily outweigh any downsides. Right in the middle is decent. Decent rings are those whose effects range anywhere from, well, decent to good, but come with a caveat, are a bit too niche, or provide a slightly above average bonus. In second to last, we have weak/niche. Rings in this category are those who have decent or potentially even good effects, but are hindered by downsides restricting their true potential. It's also the place for many rings that I consider to be severely outclassed by those in the above sections. And then there's the bottom of the barrel. Terrible. These rings provide little to no benefit. Their numbers are either way too low, or the situations they aid in are far too rare to ever justify running them. Not many rings are in this category, but the ones that are truly deserve being there. As with pretty much all of my videos, if there's any ring that I think could use a severe change or maybe just a little tweak, I'll be sure to provide some feedback. And for one last small disclaimer, all of the positions in this tier list are fairly relative. I tried to make some make sense, but there's a lot of rings in this game where, you know, it's apples and oranges kind of numbers. Like, how do you compare this damage ring to this support or defense ring? You could make separate tier lists for each kind of category, but I settled on just making one big collective piece to get all of my thoughts and opinions about the rings in this game. Also, you've probably noticed by now that the time bar down there is exceptionally obnoxiously long. This video is gonna be a whole lot of yapping. It's mostly discussion. The visuals for the most part are just gonna be this screen right here. I might occasionally in post add a couple clips here or there to show something off about a ring, but this is absolutely just a video you can toss in the background while you play a game or something. Without any further ado, let's get started. First up is Leaking Gemstone. Allows 20% of mod power generation to continue during an active mod. This effect is insanely powerful. Definitely one of the most OP rings in the game. The ability to charge active mods without the need for the feedback mutator improves their uptime dramatically. Think about all of the most powerful weapon buff mods in Remnant 2. Then imagine them being halfway charged or more by the time they end. With enough mod power generation, plus maybe some duration, you'll effectively have infinite mod uptime. If I'm being honest, this should have been the effect of the legendary bonus overpowered. This one ring alone is way stronger than that legendary bonus could ever be, specifically with active mods. And even then, you might just run one of the other legendary bonuses, because 50% more mod power generation isn't bad, but, you know, 30% crit chance and crit damage for explosions, guaranteed crit chance for explosions, even jack of all trades. When deciding what legendary bonus you want to get for an Archon setup, I would not recommend overpowered. Next up is Bisected Ring. Gain infinite stamina. All damage received is increased by 15%. Here we have what I consider to be my most despised ring in the entire game. It grants you unlimited stamina for what is essentially a small DR penalty. It effectively curb stomps every other stamina boosting source in the game. The only considerable downside is that if you run it, you can't benefit from sources that require you to consume stamina. However, if you want to use those, you aren't going to run this. Unlimited stamina is universally helpful in 99% of builds, and the DR penalty is so small you can erase most of it by just investing in bark skin. This ring lets you turn your brain off in melee builds. You don't need to worry about stamina management, just smack and dodge until everything's dead. If it weren't so easy to become tanky in Remnant 2, then the penalty would be more detrimental. When the penalty was 25%, it was still extremely good. Now it's 15% and barely a factor due to the trait system being composed of mostly defensive options. Next we have Akari Warband. On perfect dodge, increases critical chance by 10% and critical damage by 10% for 15 seconds. It's been nerfed, but damn if it still isn't one of the best rings. 10% crit chance and damage is really hard to pass up. It's also nearly guaranteed to have permanent uptime in boss fights. 15 seconds is plenty of time to land another perfect dodge. Obviously, this becomes a bit more difficult with higher weight tiers, but if you're running this ring, you probably aren't trying to face tank and flap your way to victory. Next is Burden of the Gambler. Disables weak spots, increases critical chance by 10% and critical damage by 15%. Gambler is one of the best crit rings in many setups. Although the penalty is severe on the weapons and setups that want weak spot hits, on those who can't or don't care about them, it's by far their best option. Think about how many sources of damage in the game can't weak spot hit or can't easily do so. This ring is a huge boost to their output. You could use Gift of the Unbound to remove the penalty, but then you're down a necklace slot. There's also the very small number of cases where some bosses have no weak spot. You could use Boar against them, or you could use Gambler to have an absolute advantage. Coming up is Probability Chord. Increases crit damage by 20%. Even though it's been nerfed, just like Akari Warband, it's still one of the best rings. 20% more crit damage is a huge boost, although you will need to run crit chance boosting sources to feel it. With the Prism system, it's easier than ever to achieve near guaranteed, if not fully guaranteed crits. Critical Situation, Power Fantasy, and Wrecking Ball are fantastic enablers for the ring. When your crit chance is high, you really can't go wrong with this ring. Next up is Braided Thorns. Increases crit chance by 10%. Short and sweet. 10% bonus crit chance is as good as it sounds. It doesn't give any crit damage like Akari, but it's always up, no dodging required. There's nothing stopping you from running both either. This is one of the few rings you can legitimately run in any setup and get great value from it. Sealed Resin Loop. Melee attacks can be cancelled mid-action by dodging. This ring is absolutely nuts. Its base effect is already one of the best in the game for melee setups. It effectively removes any end lag from melee attacks, letting you spam your hardest hitting moves with little risk of getting caught out so long as you have good stamina management. On top of that, it also has a ton of unintended interactions with a wide range of player actions and animations. I implore you to check the wikis and experiment with the ring. It can let you escape certain player grab animations like Talratha's. It can also mess up with some player scale animations and cause stuff to not go off. So, like I said, check out the wikis, experiments, see what the hell you can break in the game by putting this ring on. Provisioner Ring. Firearms reload over time while stowed. The OG Swap Ring. This trinket is one of the most time-efficient build pieces in the game. Passively reloading your stowed weapons is a powerful effect. It even scales with ammo reserves. The trait alone makes low max ammo weapons reload much faster. If you run Sidewinder, then you really don't need this ring, but outside of that skill, the effect is immensely helpful. It also reloads both weapons passively when you pull out your melee. Timekeeper's Jewel. Increases the duration of all status effects applied by the wearer. Duration varies per status. Timekeeper's is a stable status effect ring. It stacks multiplicatively with Affliction, making 10-second status effects become 40. It's a go-to option for ritualist builds, especially when running Miasma. It also makes energized neckcoil setups way punchier. Burden of the Destroyer. Decreases the range of all firearms by 35%. Increases all damage dealt by 15%. This is the gold standard all damage ring. Less weapon range for 15% total damage. The downside is easily counteracted by investing in Longshot, although this isn't really needed in fights that involve close quarters combat. In long range encounters, it can be a noticeable downside, but the effect is so good, it's easily the best total damage ring for a majority of setups. As we go down the list, you'll hear me bring up how you could just be running this ring over any other 15% damage ring. It just outclasses all of them, making it the best of the best. Bypass Primer. On perfect dodge, reload current firearm. In Remnant 2, any method that lets you bypass reloading is probably going to be highly valued. This ring is no exception. Being able to instantly reload some of the slowest weapons in the game is incredibly strong. Obviously, this isn't as easy with higher weight classes, but if you're running this ring, chances are you're also rocking medium to lightweight. If it already wasn't good enough, it also procs on reload sources like Void Idol or Digested Hog Lure, even if it doesn't reload any ammunition. Ring of Ordnance allows Neridian tech to gradually regenerate while both deployed or stowed. While deployed, tech will regenerate at 75% of the normal value. While stowed, tech regeneration rate is doubled. The one engineer ring to roll them all. This lets you have essentially unlimited uptime of your heavy carry and turrets if you invest enough in skill cooldown. Even if you barely invest, you're still getting a few extra shots of impact cannon per heavy carry. The doubled passive energy regen when tech is stowed away is also very handy, even if popping a relic could potentially give you more back in the case of engineer. The ring's mere existence makes the boundless energy legendary bonus completely obsolete. If you're running engineer, you should probably be using this ring. Hell, maybe you already are. Generating Band. Regenerate 3% of max health per second while a shield is active. This is easily one of my favorite shield trinkets in the game. It pairs well with literally any shield source. The healing from this ring alone has carried me through many encounters. It has some of the highest passive health regen in the game from a non-relic source. It does require a shield to be present, but shields are very common. The Insulator Mutator, Tightly Wound Coil, Warden's Prime Perk, Clear Halo, Healing Shield, Shielded Heart, the list goes on. The general ease of access to shields plus this ring's very high healing rate makes it one of the best shield trinkets in the game. Now we're moving on to very good. Devoured Loop. Critical hits have a 1% chance to reset skill cooldowns, can only occur once every 10 seconds, increases all incoming damage by 10%. When it works, it's the best cooldown and skill duration ring in the game. When it doesn't, it's a ring that actively lowers your damage reduction. It needs to be run in a high crit chance setup, preferably with at least one high fire rate weapon like the Typewriter or Bonesaw. It also only restores one skill charge per proc. However, this isn't really that much of an issue, as most skills in the game are single charge. If you run Momentum, Corrosive Rounds, along with a crit necklace and maybe a skill here or there, you'll probably proc the ring at least once per skill activation. Some skills like Rampage can break and end early if you activate it again too soon because of this ring, which is a noteworthy issue. Disaster Converter. When wearer's health drops below 25%, gain a shield for 50% of total current gray health for 10 seconds. Max 50% shield. Does not stack with itself. This pairs exceptionally well with Ring of Crisis. In a dedicated setup, you can effectively become immortal versus certain bosses. Since the ring has no cooldown, it can proc immediately after its initial shield wears off. On Apocalypse difficulty, where a large portion of bosses can wipe more than half your health away with one attack, you're going to be left with a large portion of gray health, making the ring always provide a decent amount of shield when it does proc. If you run something like Hangman's Noose or Necklace of Flowing Life, you'll be gaining even more shield when it does. Ring of Crisis. When wearer's health drops below 25%, gain a shield for 25% of max health. Lasts 10 seconds. This ring is just like Disaster Converter, but with a consistent, albeit lower, amount of max shield gained. If you're going against bosses that apply Corroded, as rare as those are, this will be the better pick of the two. It also gains the benefits from max shield bonus sources, unlike Disaster Converter. Both of these rings are pretty good safety nets, and if you decide to run both of these with Warden, you'll be getting more than 75% of your health covered by shields. Tightly Wound Coil. When spending 75% or more of current magazine, gain a shield for 15% of max health for 5 seconds. Does not stack with itself. This is an amazing defensive ring for both single shot and low mag size weapons. Although it only lasts 5 seconds, its ease of application allows unlimited uptime with select weapons. When all you have to do is shoot once to proc sources like Generating Band or one of these shield necklaces, you know you have a very good ring. Shield Alternator. Activating a mod that costs 100 mod power or greater generates a shield for 20% of max health, lasts 15 seconds, cannot stack with itself. As you know, most mods in the game cost more than 100 mod power, meaning literally any mod you cast gives you 20% shield which lasts 15 seconds. This isn't even just good with Archon, this works with literally any archetype. Depending on which mods you use, it can be easier or more challenging to keep your shield up. Besides that, this is a very consistent way of getting a good amount of shield. White Glass Bead. Perfect dodges apply a shield for 15% of max health, lasts 10 seconds, cannot stack with itself. Another super easy source of consistent shields. Like I mentioned with Akari Warband and Bypass Primer, the heavier weight classes can struggle to get this ring to proc, but if you're running this ring, you probably aren't running anything above medium. Rerouting Cable. Gain 5% of max health as shield for 5 seconds after spending 20 stamina. Accumulation resets after 5 seconds of inaction. Max 50% shield. Just like the other rings in this little section, rerouting grants the user easy access to unlimited shields by simply spending stamina. For an example of just how easy it is to gain shield with this ring, a lightweight dodge roll costs 25 stamina, meaning every dodge will see you gaining 5% max shield. Considering this ring can stack up to 50%, it's easily one of the best shield rings for lighter setups, especially if you invest into stamina regen. The 5-second duration is pretty short, but since its activation condition is so trivial, it's more than justifiable. Dying Ember. Gain 6% of base melee damage dealt as lifesteal. This is easily the best lifesteal trinket for melee builds. Leech turns it into 9%. Throw in Siphoner, Profane Heart, a Mutator, and you'll have a setup that steals back large chunks of health per swing. This is what I would consider the gold standard for lifesteal rings. Ring of Flawed Beauty. Ranged weak spot damage is increased by 25%. Ranged damage is reduced by 15% when failing to hit a weak spot. This is the Perfectionist ring. It rewards precision with a tremendous boost in weak spot damage. Its penalty is also very much felt when landing non-weak spot hits. I personally prefer using this ring with semi-auto and single-shot weapons, although with a disciplined aim, you can make it work with automatic weapons. Against targets with larger weak spot zones, it's an even better choice. Xania's Malice. Dealing weak spot damage increases weak spot damage by 5% for 5 seconds, stacks 4 times. While not as powerful as its original inception, Xania's is still a good pick on automatic and semi-auto setups. It can even work with melee damage, giving a much needed boost to something like Godsplitter, although Assassin's Dagger could also utilize the ring's effect on backstab. You can run this ring in single-shot setups, but the required buildup and short buff duration makes it challenging for the weapon class to fully utilize it. However, there's nothing stopping you from just running an automatic secondary like the MP60 or Tech 22 to build up stacks before swapping back to your long gun. Ring of Omens. Evades cost 15% max health as Grey Health instead of stamina. Now, the ring says 15% by default, but it's actually a flat 15 health. When you increase your max health, you'll actually notice the tooltip updates to say less than 15%, and now you know why. When combined with compatible necklaces, it grants Misty Step, which can help bypass ultra heavy dodges. Investing in Grey Health regen or stocking up on bandages lets you mitigate the downside of using health to dodge. When paired with Rally Band, you can on demand get your dodge health back in melee setups. Not needing stamina to dodge lets you spam charged melees to your heart's content. It's also effectively unlimited dodge rolls, as the game lets you keep dodge rolling even if you're at full Grey Health. This fact makes it one of the best sources of maintaining Grey Health. Rally Band. Melee strikes convert Grey Health into health. Each melee strike converts up to 10% of max health. This is easily my favorite Grey Health related trinket, although a close second is coming up in a bit. This ring turns your Grey Health bar into a Bloodborne style rally mechanic when using melee. The faster you can swing your weapon, the faster you can get your missing health back. Sources that increase your Grey Health conversion like Dark Pact are immensely helpful when running this ring. One ring in particular that we'll discuss down the line is a very powerful option to run alongside this. Obviously, if you're face tanking damage back to back, you won't be seeing much use out of this ring, but if you utilize perks like Medic's Backbone or the Steadfast Mutator, you can retain or convert enough Grey Health to make this playstyle not as punishing. Game Master's Pride. Reduces all healing by 50%, splits all damage and remaining healing evenly among all allies wearing this ring. Now, I'll admit I haven't used this ring in a serious setup for a few months, but after everything that's been added to Remnant 2 since, the rings, archetypes, prism system, I can only imagine what kind of wacky stuff is possible with it now. I'm only putting it in very good for the sole reason that I haven't used it since way back then, but if you wanted to argue it should be higher now, I would have no objections. As for what the ring actually does, it essentially merges you and your allies' health bars into one. If you have a teammate who's not as skilled at evading attacks, this ring can be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, you can increase their survivability by a substantial amount. On the other hand, you might end up regretting wearing this ring when they get hit by some multi-stage attack that ends up draining both of your bars, like Shahala's Black Hole attack. Instant kill moves like Magister Dulane's Tongue Grab will also instantly kill anyone connected via the ring. With the right setups, however, you can become incredibly tanky, making every mistake made far less personally punishing. Infinity Pocket. Reloading an empty magazine fills 10% of the stud weapon's max ammo. When stud weapon is full, the refill amount applies to the primary weapon instead. This ring is almost like a mini version of Zero Divide. It essentially grants you constant ammo refunding, and on small mag size weapons, it just straight up gives unlimited ammo. It even scales with ammo reserves. With enough reserves, you can make even medium mag size weapons have near infinite ammo. Just like with Zero Divide, it's also a random world drop on the Rood. Token of Favor. Increases all damage by 5%. Gain 10% critical chance against exposed targets. The exposed effect is most easily applied by Monolith, although since the mod no longer applies the status effect, you're left with applying it only via the primary fire. There are a few necklaces that can apply exposed to enemies as well, although only 2 of them I would really consider running, and even then it'd have to be in select setups. I kind of wish there was a ring for applying these status effects, or that even Corrupted Room Pistol could apply it. More methods of applying exposed would make the few rings we have far better. That being said, 10% crit chance is a very nice boost when you can apply exposed. It is worth bringing up that in multiplayer sessions, exposed is a lot easier to apply when you have your friends to apply it for you. In solo play though, you're restricted to your own arsenal. Archer's Crest. Increases projectile speed by 20% and decreases weapon charge time by 25%. This is pretty much the go-to pick for builds with charge weapons. When combined with Supercharger, you'll hit 55% charge speed. The projectile speed bonus is alright, although it's the only real boost you'll ever need to that stat. The difference is noticeable, although in close range encounters it's not really as needed. The ring could just be 25% faster weapon charge time and it would still be up here. Feathery Binding. Increases projectile speed by 15% and decreases weapon charge time by 10%. Bonus is doubled when haste is active. With the perception trait maxed, having haste with this ring gives 30% faster charge speed. Throw on Supercharger and Archer's Crest and you're at the cap. Again, the projectile speed is alright, but it's really not necessary. Dull Steel Ring. Reduces dodge weight threshold by 1 level. Although it's been nerfed, I still enjoy this ring quite a bit. The drop in weight class means you'll never flop. You can stack as much weight as you want without being punished. It also means you'll not suffer the increased stamina cost of the ultra heavy bracket either, something the original didn't do. Its ability to drop you down to the next weight class effortlessly makes this a great comfort pick. If Strongback isn't enough to bring you down a tier and you aren't running Challenger, drop the point investment and pick up this ring. Drakestone Pearl. Enables stamina regeneration during melee attacks at 20% of the normal rate. The best part of this ring is that it scales with stamina recovery bonuses. It also makes regular melee attacks great for keeping damage up while your stamina recovers. The Hypercharger Mutator can be a good pick with it as well, as the 100 extra stamina regen makes good use of the ring's effect. This next section covers all the unarmed damage boosting rings. Placement wise, you could put any of them above or below the others. It's entirely up to personal preference. Meteorite Shard Ring. Increases encumbrance by 50, increases unarmed damage by 50%. This ring increases your weight by an insane amount. In return, it grants you a huge unarmed damage boost. I highly recommend either fully investing into phase tanking or running Dull Steel Ring if you choose to run this one. You'll definitely need one or the other to survive the heavy penalty. Demolition Coil. Unarmed, charged melee attacks explode when hitting an enemy, dealing 30% additional damage over 1.5 meters. This is probably my favorite unarmed ring of the bunch. It just adds explosions to your charged unarmed attacks. On the Dark Matter Gauntlets, this effect procs every tick of the beam. When combined with Volatile Strike in either Wrecking Ball or Power Fantasy, you can absolutely obliterate anything that stands in your path. The AoE does scale with size boosts, but it's such a small base AoE, you really won't be getting a ton more coverage by investing in it. Tarnished Ring. Increases damage of unarmed attacks by 30%. This is the most basic of the bunch. Can't really go wrong with picking this when running unarmed weapons. Every unarmed ring provides such a massive boost that running any other basic melee ring with them is pretty pointless. Because they are locked to only being used on 2 melee weapons is the reason why I have them in only very good. Although I could see the argument for them being an excellent. Black Cat Band. When taking fatal damage, instead of dying, the wearer's health will drop to 1. Cleanses all negative status effects and movement speed increases by 25% for 10 seconds, 2-minute cooldown. This is the most accessible second chance mechanic outside of archetype skills. It's a staple of hardcore runs. While I don't personally run it outside of the mode, it can be a lifesaver for less experienced players. There is one noteworthy issue. In the case you're struck with a corroded or burning dot when the ring procs, chances are you'll be killed by it immediately after the ring's short invincibility wears off. If you have the dot on beforehand, however, it will remove it, which is nice. Floodlit Diamond. Increases weak spot damage by 12%. Bonus is doubled against exposed targets. Just like Token of Favor, this ring can provide a nice damage boost against exposed enemies. If exposed was a little more accessible across builds, I'd put both this and Token into excellent tier. But since you are restricted to a select few weapons, or relying on co-op partners to apply it, I'm knocking them down a tier. Hardcore Metal Band. Taking damage grants 1 stack of Bulwark for 10 seconds, max 3 stacks. Were this the original iteration, I would have definitely placed it in excellent tier. Now that it's limited to 3 stacks, I think it's still very good. It's still possible to easily build and maintain stacks via sources like Atonement Fold or Oil Pots. The remaining 2 can come from another source like one of the associated rings, some skills, or even Sweet Leaf. Is it nerfed? Yes. Is it still very good and worth using? Absolutely. Matriarch's Ring. Perfect dodges reduce charge melee stamina cost by 100% for 7 seconds. This pairs exceptionally well with Wormhole, since every activation procs the ring. This combo lets you spam charge melee attacks for a brief duration, keeping your stamina available for dodging. I'm tempted to say the duration could be upped, but I kind of like it at 7 seconds. If they were to buff it, 10 seconds would probably be fine. Burden of the Audacious. Decreases all healing by 50%. Perfect dodges heal for 25% of max health. I'm gonna preface this ranking by stating my judgment is based on its intended effect, which is still very strong. There is a pretty broken bug right now where if you only partially invest into triage, the healing exponentially increases, far more than if you invested into every possible source of healing effectiveness. I'm making this list with the slight hope that maybe we get one more balance patch, but in the case we don't get one, go ahead and throw this in excellent tier. Besides that, this is still a very good alternative healing ring. Getting a quarter of your health back every perfect dodge feels amazing, and if you happen to have a Prism with Artful Dodger, you gain the ability to heal that chunk back every 3 seconds, or twice if you also manage to perform a real perfect dodge. Ring of Phantom Pain. Missing health is converted to 10 gray health per second, reduces gray health regeneration by 90%. This is my second favorite gray health ring. It has the built-in effect of Old Dark Pact, as well as a unique gray health generation mechanic. Although you can't really build for gray health regen with this ring, you can utilize other gray health sources very effectively. One example that immediately comes to mind are bandages. Just like with Ring of Omens, we can use them here as a way to instantly convert any gray health to real health. This lets you run non-healing hearts like Diverting Heart or Gossamer Heart and still have a way of healing yourself. Obviously, the more health you have, the longer it'll take the ring to fill your empty bar with gray health. The average player is probably going to have between 130 and 150 health, meaning in the absolute worst case, you'll have to wait between 13 and 15 seconds to make the bandage use a full heal. This time scenario is heavily dependent on difficulty. If you're playing on the lower ones where you can take several hits back to back, you're going to lose lots of gray health. However, on Apocalypse, unless you're running a super tanky setup, many enemies and bosses will make half if not more of your health gray after hitting you, meaning you'll only need to wait around half that max time to get the full heal. You can also run Salvage Start to guarantee every use of the relic is a full heal no matter what. A very unique ring, one I am glad was added in the 3rd DLC. Burden of the Follower. Reduces fire rate by 15%. Increases mod power generation by 30%. While it's not as strong as its initial version, a 30% mod power gen boost is still pretty good. This ring can be purely beneficial in the right setups, completely ignoring the fire rate penalty. And as one last note, it's a great pick for boosting all forms of mod power generation from non-damage sources like Feedback's main effect, passive mod generation from Archon, Insight, Rings, etc., and from trinkets that grant mod power based on some kind of conversion or activation. Phelan Sigil. Melee damage generates 15% additional mod power. After playing with this ring, it's way better than I ever realized. It's not 15% increased mod power generation, it's 15% additional mod power generation. By default, melee attacks generate 25% of their base damage as mod power for both weapons. This ring increases that percentage to 40%. For a comparison, the trait Arcane Strike would bring the 25% to an effective 37.5%, a smaller bonus than this one ring. When you combine the trait with Phelan's, however, things get even more powerful. Phelan's with Arcane Strike brings melee damage mod power generation to 60% of its base damage for both weapons. Throw in Spirit and it becomes 68%. And if you're running this ring, you might as well throw in one true King Sigil, making the ring's effect become an additional 22.5%. Adding everything here together, you'll be generating 80.75% of base melee damage as mod power for both weapons. This is actually really strong in the right hands, and in the right situations of course. Red Ring of Death. Duplicates the less damaging negative status applied to the target, reduces outgoing status effect damage by 10%. This ring is best used in setups with one single strong dot, whether that be from Star Shot, Heat Wave, or Hellfire's Explosive Shot. The way it works is that per target, the first dot to be applied to them will be doubled until it ends. This does discourage the use of multiple dots, via something like Miasma, but when placed in the right setup, it makes a huge difference with one dot. I don't recommend running this with Overloaded too much though. While it does double the damage of the Overloaded Blast, you're still waiting at least 5 seconds between every instance of dot damage. If Overloaded were every 2 or 3 seconds, it'd feel way better, although it could stay at 5 seconds when applied to the player. Mortal Coil. Increases all damage dealt by 1% for every 2% of the wearer's total lifesteal. max 20% all damage. In my opinion, this works best with Death Wish on Ritualist, with either Nightmare Spiral or Bloodless King's Oath, or Decayed Margin and Dying Ember and melee setups. If you do run Profane Heart, it plus Leech alone makes you only need to hit 20% base lifesteal to hit the max damage bonus. As you would expect, the damage bonus pulls from your total collective sources of lifesteal and is affected by efficacy. Only lifesteal sources that appear in the Advanced Stats tab will count towards the damage bonus, however. This means lifesteal from sources like Edgelord and Vampire Blade will not help. Shadow of Misery. Increase status effect damage by 20%. Sometimes when it comes to trinkets, less is more. 20% bonus status damage is a great boost for builds that rely on them. You really can't go wrong with this on Ritualist. Nightmare Sigil. On perfect dodge, increases base lifesteal by 5% for 10 seconds. This ring provides a pretty good source of easily accessible lifesteal for any build. 10 seconds may seem short, but when you add on Siphoner and Leech, you're already hitting 12% total lifesteal. Toss in Profane Heart and its use effects, and you're at 22%. If you use the Bulldog in that setup, you'll be healing 46.2 health a second. That's pretty damn good. It being universal means you could also use melee or dots at the same time for even more lifesteal. Bloodless King's Vow. I've now just realized I referred to this ring earlier on as Bloodless King's Oath. Whoops. Gain 4% of base range damage dealt as lifesteal. This ring is like Dying Ember but for ranged weapons, and arguably just as good. It is 2% less than Dying Ember, but having a flat 4% lifesteal with no downside is great when in a dedicated Leech build. If you use this, Nightmare Spiral, Profane Heart, Leech, and Siphoner, you're hitting 40% range lifesteal. Absolutely nutty, and definitely shows how insanely strong Leech has become in Remnant 2. Alchemy Stone. Increases base lifesteal by 6% when suffering from a negative status or blight effect. On its own, I would place this ring in Terrible. However, if you're running this ring, chances are you're also running something else to proc its effect permanently, like Atonement Fold or Oil Pots. 6% total lifesteal is really good. With Leech, that becomes 9%. I'm not going to bore you with the same details as before, you get the idea why it's good. Bridge Warden's Crest. Perfect Dodge increases melee damage by 20% for 10 seconds. Perfect Evade Flop also gains 10% damage reduction for the duration. Similar to Matriarch's Ring but with damage. The flop aspect doesn't really matter, as unless you also invest into evade speed, you'll be spending most of the damage buff on the floor. In the appropriate builds, it's a very good melee damage ring. It works exceedingly well with Wormhole for the same reasons as Matriarch's. Crimson Dreamstone. Critical hits increase skill damage by 2% for 5 seconds. Max 10 stacks. This is a very good damage option with skills like Havoc Form, Way of Keula, and Engineer Tech. It does have a short duration, but it only loses 1 stack at a time, which makes maintaining the ring's effects pretty manageable with automatic weapons. Sapphire Dreamstone. Critical hits reduce skill cooldowns by 4%. Can only happen once every 2 seconds. This is the more consistent, albeit much less powerful brother of Devloop. The longer your current cooldowns, the more time this ring shaves off, although it can still be a nice pick at lower amounts. It pairs really well with the Dervish melee mutator for even more skill cooldown. Its being a consistent effect means you don't have to stack nearly as much crit chance to get value from the ring. Chances are with your basic archetype bonuses and fragments, you'll be able to crit once every 2 seconds or so. Burden of the Sciolist. Reduces ammo reserves by 20%. Increases mod and skill damage by 15%. Another simple ring, this one with a not so bad downside. 20% less ammo is easily countered by the reserves trait, that is if you actually care. It's fairly easy nowadays to make setups that need little to no input from your weapon's primary fire to cycle mods, making this ring a no-brainer pick for those builds. It is only 15% skill and mod damage though, and as we know, there is one ring to rule them all in that category. However, there is nothing stopping you from running both together. Soul Shard. Increases all damage dealt by 5% for each active summon, max 15%. Another 15% total damage ring, this one being tied to active summons on the field. On summoner builds, this is a freebie, although you can work this into other builds, such as Handler, with one of your weapons equipped with Knight's Guard. Space Grabs can give you a short-lived burst of the ring's buff, or you can use Root Lash with Familiar. There are multiple ways to achieve max stacks. Black Spinal. Applying a negative status effect grants 2% max health per second for 3 seconds. Applying or refreshing a negative status effect while the buff is active will increase the duration by 1.5 seconds, max 15 seconds. With Triage maxed out, the healing becomes 3% per second. Weapons with inane dots like Sparkfire, Enigma, Nebula, etc. are great options for keeping the duration maxed out. Throwing in mods and mutators that also apply dots can give you 2 or 3 extensions per proc. Encrypted Ring. Using a mod regenerates 20% of max health over 10 seconds, can stack up to 30 seconds. This ring has what I wish Stream Coupler also had. A stackable duration. This ring provides easy healing to mod setups, especially ones that have cheap costs like Prismatic Driver or Stasis Beam. Stream Coupler. Using a skill regenerates 25% of max health over 10 seconds. This ring works very well with Burden of the Stargazer to mitigate the health loss. Triage makes the regen 3.75 per second, which is very nice. In sacrifice loop setups, this is pretty much mandatory. Like I just mentioned with Encrypted Ring, I do wish this had a stackable duration though. Yes, the healing is higher, but come on, it could at least stack up to 20 seconds, for the 2 skills you have. Constant Variable Ring. Increases range damage up to 20% based on current weapon's overheat value. Before the 3rd DLC came out, this ring had a hard time being worked into most heat-based builds. It's always been better to just let the heat dissipate. But with the addition of Exhaust Valve, it's actually a great option now for heat weapons using the necklace. It helps offset the DPS loss due to EV's reduced rate of fire at max heat. If the 3rd DLC never added that necklace, this would be down in weak tier. Microcompressor. Reduces heat generation per round when firing weapons that overheat by 30%. Increases heat decay rate by 30%. This is a staple heat weapon ring. It's very good in their associated setups, and usually enough as far as reducing heat goes, although it can be run with the Ingenuity Mutator for even more heat slowdown. Nowadays, you're either going to run this by itself, or Constant Variable Ring with Exhaust Valve. The choice is up to you. Conservation Seal. For every 10% of missing health, max 50%, gain 10% chance to not consume relic, and 5% increased relic efficacy on next use. On Apocalypse difficulty, if you aren't running a ton of damage reduction, you'll get constant value from this ring. Even if you don't roll the free relic chance, you're still getting increased relic efficacy. Combine this with Emergency Switch to never run out of relic charges. Burden of the Warlock. Reduces mod power requirement by 15%. Activating a mod costs 15% health as Grey Health. Conversion cannot kill wearer. Now that we've lost the mod cost reduction fragments, this is one of the last few methods of making mods cheaper. The Grey Health conversion downside can be remedied by investing in Bloodstream. I don't recommend running this with mods that rapid fire like Prismatic Driver or Stasis Beam, as you'll drain your health in seconds. Burden of the Divine. All damage dealt by the wearer is reduced by 15%. 30% of self-healing applies to allies. The damage penalty is very noticeable. It's like you're always landing non-weak spot hits with Ring of Fly Beauty. The extra healing towards your friends more than makes up for it. The effect is more noticeable with human allies than a handler's dog or summoner summons. Even still, it makes passive health regen provide medics with a constant stream of progress towards their free relic charges. I haven't tested it, but I imagine it works really well in a Game Master's Pride build. Outside of that setup, I think this ring is best left to the medical professionals. Brawler's Pride. Increases melee attack speed by 15% and melee critical chance by 5%. This is a staple of almost every melee build I've ever made. 15% total melee attack speed and a nice little crit boost makes it stand out as one of the better melee rings you can run. It is worth noting though that melee attack speed doesn't affect every melee action. Some attacks like flail spins are not boosted by the stat. 9 times out of 10 however, you'll be getting great value from this ring. Anastasia's Inspiration. When receiving healing effects, gain haste for 10 seconds. This is a very reliable source of haste, although slightly less valuable now due to the addition of the haste consumable. As long as you put a single point into regrowth, you'll have the effect 24/7. I have nothing else to say, it's just a super reliable source of haste. Soul Guard. Gain a stack of Bulwark for each active summon. This ring is a far more balanced concept than something like old Hardcore Metal Band. With enough summons, you'll be able to have max Bulwark stacks from just one ring. That does require a bit of investment though, as you would imagine. If you're playing Handler, you'll always have 1 stack of Bulwark, and if you have Summoner, you'll always have at least 2. So long as your summons are alive. Running both of them together means you'll practically have 3 stacks at all times. All you need then is just 1 more mod to get 2 more summons, and there you go, max stacks. This is a very good defensive ring for all of those dedicated summoners out there. Heart of the Wolf. Increases max stamina by 25 and movement speed by 10%. 25 max stamina and 10% move speed on a single ring is very good. If you're at 130 stamina from maxing out endurance, this ring at minimum gives you 1 more dodge roll. It can also give you an extra charge swing or 2 of your melee weapon, and the movement speed bonus can help you out in a ton of situations. I don't run this ring often, but I can appreciate how strong it is. Seal of the Empress. Increases max health by 20, reduces maximum stamina by 5. This ring grants 20 health for what is effectively a non-existent downside. If it were the old version, it would potentially remove 1 dodge roll from your stamina bar, but with it being 5 now, the chances of that happening are very slim. Tear of Lydusa. Increases healing and lifesteal efficacy by 20%. Reduces healing efficacy bonus by 1.5% for each 10% of missing relic capacity. This is the only source in the game that boosts both lifesteal and healing effectiveness. Its effect does discourage you from using relics, but in some cases that's completely fine. Profane and Tranquil Heart are both relics that you can run without consuming them. Yeah, you'll be missing out on their active effects, but you'll be boosting your lifesteal and healing sources simultaneously. I also now just noticed this writing the script that it only penalizes the healing effectiveness per missing relic charge, which is interesting. I always assumed it was both. Tempest Conduit. After receiving elemental damage, increases all damage dealt by 15% and resistance to the received element by 20 for 15 seconds. This is literally just a better version of all of the elemental rings. It can easily be procced by player weapons like Hellfire, Enigma, and Gas Giant for each respective element. This ring is also a great pick for fights featuring a major element like Dulain, Red Prince, Gwendol, and Blob King. Ring of Grace. Taking enemy damage causes 15% of maximum health to regenerate over 10 seconds. This is one of the OG face tanking rings. Triage brings the healing to 2.25% of your max health healed every second. This makes it a great filler ring in said setups, allowing you to heal back a good chunk of damage taken. Multi-hit and swift bosses can unfortunately minimize the effect, as the duration will refresh, but it might not be enough to seriously patch you up. Ring of Retribution. Incoming enemy damage increases reload speed and all outgoing damage by 15%, lasts 15 seconds. Although this ring does require you to be hit by an enemy to activate, this is Remnant 2. It's not exactly hard to squeeze in a little bit of defense into your builds to tank at least one hit every now and again. Obviously this works best in face tanking setups, however if you run Ring of Grace or even Decayed Heart, you'll be able to reactively heal some or all of the damage you take in non-dedicated builds. A 15% damage and reload speed boost for 15 seconds makes this a great retaliation tool. Zohe's Ring. Increases mod duration by 20%. This is what I consider the baseline entry for very good. Probably. There are so many rings in this game, I had to place the cutoff point somewhere. This ring is just a nice little duration boost. You could argue it belongs in Decent, and if I were making this tier list over again, I might have put it there. Sometimes it's just nice to get a few more seconds from your mods. Combined with Chakra, you're pushing 50% more mod duration. This ring's bonus is also more than what you would get from a Fragment, unlike a certain skill duration ring we'll talk about later. Also, we stan Zohe in this house, so its connection to her makes it automatically above average. Now we're moving on to the rings that I consider to be less impactful, but can still help out in many builds. Burden of the Rebel. Reduces relic use speed by 25%. Reduces skill cooldowns by 15%. This ring provides a nice boost to skill cooldown, at the cost of making your personal relic use speed much slower. This downside can be mitigated by select archetype perks, like Intuition from Hunter, Benefactor from Medic, some rings like Celerity Stone, Fey Shaman Ring, or by just investing into Glutton. Some relics also have innate faster use speeds, or don't need to be used to benefit you, making the ring's penalty even less noticeable sometimes. Of the two cooldown boosting burden rings, I usually go with this one due to its easier to manage downside. Burden of the Stargazer. Reduces skill cooldowns by 15%. Activating a skill costs 15% health. The penalty of Stargazer is a bit more punishing compared to Rebel. Some trinkets, like Stream Coupler, can help heal up the ring's health cost. Lifesteal can also be a great method of regaining lost health, especially with all of the methods we've already gone over in this list. Do be careful when using skills with multiple charges, however. Archetype abilities like War Stomp and Quick Draw can rapidly deplete your health when used back to back, becoming a more prominent issue when their cooldowns are very short. Atonement Fold. Self-inflicts bleeding status upon the wearer, causing 0.275 to 0.55 bleed damage per second, increases critical chance by 5%. This ring is very good in the builds it assists, acting as a proc source for Hardcore Metal Band, Alchemy Stone, Nightweaver's Grudge, etc. It can constantly provide you with a bit of grey health, making Bitter Memento pretty pointless. Its bleed damage is based on difficulty, and counts as self-inflicted friendly fire damage, meaning kinship affects it twice. Thankfully, it's not increased by total damage sources, and can be completely countered by investing into regrowth. Bleeding does cut your healing effectiveness in half, which can be a very hefty downside. Triage can alleviate this downside, but you might as well just invest in Leech. If the ring still gave 10% crit chance, I'd have placed it in very good. Feastmaster Signet increases active concoction limit by 1. Brewmaster's Cork, Spirited from Alchemist, and the legendary bonus Heavy Drinker all provide more than this one single ring. That doesn't inherently mean the ring is terrible though. think of it as a ring that has a selectable effect. It could be 20 health, 20 stamina, 10% move speed, 20 stamina regen, 2 gray health regen, you get the point. If you're running Alchemist or Brewmasters, you really don't need to run this, but because of its potential, I can't rate this below a lot of other rings on this list. Fey Protector Signet increases max health and stamina by 10 and reduces encumbrance by 5. This ring is a very solid filler pick for many builds. The encumbrance reduction is minor, but you may be able to drop a weight class if you tweak your armor enough. It's hard to go wrong with 10 more health and stamina. Dead King's Memento increases health by 15. While not as impressive anymore thanks to the introduction of the Prism system, it's still a decent bit of extra health. I'd say if you have access to Seal of the Empress though, you should probably run that instead. On a fresh run, this ring can be purchased from Cass, making it one of the best easy-to-access rings in the early game, doubly so on hardcore runs. Ring of the Robust increases max health by 10 and armor by 20. This ring could be potentially better for you depending on your playstyle. In a naked Daredevil build, this is technically better than running Dead King's Memento. If you invest into Barkskin and Fortify, you can hit 21.7% DR, which is not bad for having no armor. Outside of that playstyle though, this ring's benefits will heavily vary depending on which armor you run. The more armor your set gives, the less effective this ring's armor boost will be due to diminishing returns. Elevated Ring increases dodge weight threshold by 10, reduces encumbrance by 10. I was kind of conflicted as to where to put this ring. It's like an 80% version of Dull Steel Ring. It can make a difference on plenty of armors, but I think its best use case is with the newly added Fader set. This set, when ran with the ring plus Strongback, can drop you down 2 weight classes. Throw in Dull Steel Ring and you're light rolling with pretty good DR. Because it's almost as good as Dull Steel Ring, I've placed it in upper decent. Burden of the Protector reduces incoming shield duration by 50%, increases shield amount by 15%. For shield sources that are easily activated, like the rings mentioned in Very Good, this ring is great. The shield duration penalty is very punishing though. Thankfully, the newly added trait Preservation can reduce this penalty to a measly 20% reduction. This ring combined with the Barrier trait makes all shield sources, the ones that scale anyway, 30% more effective. On some shield sources like Healing Shield or Shielded Heart, this won't have any effect unless you are running the Defensive Measures Legendary bonus. But on the ones it does benefit, this can be a solid method of getting more bang for your buck. Reaping Stone. After an elemental status effect is removed from wearer, they become immune to all elemental status effects and gain 5% of base damage dealt as lifesteal for 10 seconds. This is a very neat leech and elemental status resistance ring. In fights where enemies have innate dots, this ring can be a decent way of limiting their uptime on you, as well as rewarding clearing said dots with a good amount of lifesteal. Even if whatever you're fighting doesn't have elemental dots, you can activate this ring by yourself by running oil pots and or using Atonement Fold. Simply put yourself out, or use a bandage when Atonement Fold is equipped and the ring activates. This does actually stop Atonement Fold's bleeding dot for 10 seconds, which can be helpful or harmful depending on your current build. Ritualist can also do the same activation by using a relic when afflicted to proc the ring. Overall, a very unique blend of elemental dot defense and lifesteal. You might have catched that the ring specifically mentions elemental status effects, but bleeding, as we will establish later, is not considered an element by the game, so I'm like 99% sure that it's just any status effect. Siphon Filter increases all damage dealt by an amount equal to an active haste bonus. Grants haste when within 15 meters of an entity suffering from slow. Depending on your trade investment and legendary bonus, this ring's damage boost will vary drastically. On its own, it'll only grant a 7% total damage boost, but if you invest in Perception and pick up the hyperactive legendary bonus, this shoots up to 20%. The latter half is harder to obtain, and depending on what you want, it might just be better to pick up Jack of all Trades or Sharpshooter for their increased damage gains compared to hyperactive. Realistically, on average, it's going to be a 10% damage boost if you plan on incorporating haste into your build. This ring also has the added effect of granting haste when within a scalable 15-meter radius of slowed entities. Slow isn't super common in the player's arsenal, but you do have a few tools that can apply the status for upwards of 10 or 20 seconds, depending on which source you use, and if you invest into Affliction and run Timekeeper's Jewel. I highly recommend Time Weaver, as it can reach 20 seconds of slow in the right setup. Slayer's Crest increases melee damage by 25% when attacking enemies from behind. This ring's usefulness heavily depends on the enemy and boss type being faced. Using Invader and playing in co-op can make landing backstabs much easier. When it does work, you'll be feeling that damage boost. If you can't physically reach a target's back though, there's plenty of other options out there to boost general melee damage that you can run instead. Haymaker's Ring Increase melee damage by 0.2% for every 1 point of armor encumbrance. This ring is limited to unarmed builds with Leader's Mark 1 and Meteorite Shard Ring for the highest realistic melee damage boost it can grant. In those setups, it provides a 29% melee damage boost, which is pretty good. Outside of that though, it only provides a 19% to 22% melee damage bonus depending if you run Black Greatsword or not with Leader's Mark 1. It's worth noting that Leader's Mark 2 is only 1% less damage compared to Leader's Mark 1, and you can make it heavy roll with Strongback invested, so it's best you stick with that set if you wish to run this ring. Ring of the Damned. Increases all damage by 0.4% for each 1% of Grey health. Increases critical chance by 5% if at least 50% of max health is Grey. For half health builds using Hangman's Noose, it's a good damage option. Outside of running that necklace though, it can be difficult to maintain the Grey health unless you have something like Ring of Phantom Pain also equipped. Broken Heart plus Phantom Pain can be a decent substitute for the necklace should you wish to run this ring. Medic's Backbone and Numbing Agent can be decent methods of keeping Grey health through hits as well. Soul Link. Summons lifesteal 5% of base damage dealt, which returns to the wearer as health. This ring does count summoner sacrifice damage for the lifesteal. It's not affected by lifesteal efficacy sources, which is a bit of a shame. This is because your summons gain lifesteal, not you. With just one summon like the Handler's Dog, it's pretty bad. However, when you just spam as many summons as possible, the lifesteal adds up. Even if summons can be pretty buggy at times, this ring can be a solid way of being topped off on health in a summoner or mod summon setup. Fey Warrior Ring. Increases melee damage by 15%. This is a super basic ring. There are better and worse options out there you could be running. Because of that, this ring falls into the decent category. Not exactly in the middle, but fairly close. Empowering Loop. Increases range damage by 15%, slows firearm charge time by 10%, and reduces fire rate by 10%. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. In Remnant 1, this was one of my favorite rings. Now, its Remnant 2 version isn't bad. It's an above average pick for single-shot weapons, but for everything else, it's just meh. The reduced charge speed and fire rate penalties aren't too punishing, but since it only gives a 15% range damage boost, it's barely an improvement for already fast-firing weapons, basically only amounting to a 5% DPS increase. Since it's still a decent pick with single-shot weapons, I can't place it any lower. Berserker's Crest. Increases melee speed by 10% and reduces melee stamina cost by 30%. A solid melee filler ring. The stamina cost reduction is definitely the best part in my mind, although there are other ways of gaining stamina back through melee, or negating its cost entirely, making the ring not as effective in the grand scheme of things. Still, it's not bad at all. 10% more melee speed is a nice bonus, and if you find yourself running Black Greatsword for whatever reason, this ring will provide you an additional 10% faster stack gain rate on top of its base effect. Closed Loop. Gain 5% of max health as shield for 10 seconds after a charge shot. Accumulation resets after 10 seconds of an action. Max 25% shield. Realistically, you could honestly place this ring in very good if you so desired. The only thing holding it back in my mind is the fact that its max shield is 25%, and the scaling only applies to the per charge shot value. It's not the only shield source that scales like this, of course. Rerouting Cable and Insulator both have the exact same interaction. In those cases, however, they either provide more total potential shield or are more easily accessible to any build. Charge weapons typically need a bit more investments than regular weapons due to them needing charge speed instead of fire rate. This comes in the form of Supercharger or Sequence Shot, Archer's Crest, and some other combination of charge speed sources to hit the 80% cap. Don't get me wrong, this is a good shield ring with charge weapons. Its restriction to only that class of weapons makes it less worth it in my eyes though. Tightly wound coil works best with single shot and low mag weapons, but it can still function with others, even if the short duration isn't nearly as worth it on them. Feeding Tube. While in combat, auto-consume the compatible item in the first quick slot every 30 seconds. Increases consumable and relic use speed by 10%. Not compatible with concoctions, grenades, and some unique consumables. Similarly to Feastmasters, it's a ring whose effect can be essentially selected. Granted, this effect is also the equivalent of just hitting a single button and waiting a few seconds. With potency, this makes pretty much every consumable have a long enough duration to loop with the ring. Its main benefit is the auto-consumption aspect, letting you do whatever you need to without being interrupted. If it were just this effect, it would be in lower decent, but the increased relic and consumable use speed bring it up a little bit. Celerity Stone. increases consumable and relic use speed by 25%. This is a comfort ring for many players. Relic and consumable use speed help reduce the downtime of using said items in the heat of combat, where getting one popped off could be the difference between life and death. This ring is really good at helping prevent those moments where you're fractions of a second away from using your relic, only to get clipped by some random ad. If Glutton didn't exist and there weren't various relics with innate use speed bonuses, I consider this ring a lot higher. Even then, I can't deny how good this ring feels to run. Deceiver's Band. After performing a slide, gain 15% evade speed and 10% movement speed for 12 seconds. Unless you're trying to slink into cover, you probably won't be doing too much sliding in Remnant 2. Sliding does grant iframes, making it one of the few ways Ultra Heavy can dodge without being slowed down. It's only 7 iframes, but if you get good at the timing, you could style on some bosses. The evade speed is mostly what I care about. Combined with other sources, you can legitimately dodge faster than sprinting. The duration is short, but sliding is the same for all weights and everything but stamina cost, making it easy to proc whenever you want. All of that being said, you can gain these same bonuses by just eating some Ambit Ember, which by default lasts an entire minute. There's also Haste, which can provide a 10% bonus or more depending on your build. Flyweight Sting. Increases melee damage while armor encumbrance is below 50. Damage bonus increases with lower encumbrance, up to 25% at 0 weight. The maximum melee damage bonus is actually kind of nice. Unfortunately, it comes at the cost of severely limiting your choice of armor, or forego using it entirely. If you do go naked, you're more than likely going to grab the flat armor legendary bonus from the Prism system to not get one shot. Using the Bandit set, with heavy drink and some trinkets, can help you lower your encumbrance value to gain the full damage bonus without going commando. Dull Signet. Increases damage reduction by 10%. Each weight class above light reduces damage reduction bonus by 2.5% up to 3 times. This ring rewards you with a nice amount of damage reduction for being at lighter weights. Using concoctions, strong back, and other trinkets, you can adjust your weight value and threshold to gain the 10% DR with multiple armor sets. You could even use the Threshold Legendary bonus to get the effect on literally any set. Although with the 30% DR and 150 armor legendaries, it's probably far less valuable. The way I see this ring, if you're running a light set, it's a free 10% DR. If you're medium, you'll have to put in a bit more work, but it's still better than something like Lithic Signet. If you're heavy or ultra, obviously don't run this ring. Hardened Coil. Reduces all incoming damage by 3% for each 10% of missing health. Max 15% reduction. A very good defensive option for half-health builds. This plus Restriction Cord puts you at 30% DR. Add in Bark Skin, Fortify, and Bulwark, and you'll become much sturdier at lower health values. You can also run this ring in a non-half-health setup and potentially take an extra hit depending on your max health and the rest of your build. Impact Augment. When a single source of enemy damage exceeds 15% of max health, increase all damage dealt by 3% for 10 seconds. Max 5 stacks. This is like Ring of Retribution if you needed to be punched in the face 5 times more often. I'm not sure why it only grants 15% damage when Retribution is literally the same for a longer period from any source of enemy damage, and it also grants reload speed. This ring in a face tank setup isn't bad. It does total up to 15%, and the stacks do only go down 1 at a time. That being said, if you have to choose between the two, there's no reason to pick up this over Retribution. Point Focus Ring. Reduces weapon spread and recoil by 30%. This is a solid choice for tightening weapon spread on the shotgun class of weapons. You can run it on other types of weapons, but if you really want a bit of spread reduction, I recommend investing points into handling instead. With shotguns, if you run this, handling, and one other source, you can turn them into high-powered rifles. I'm glad this ring was partially unnerfed. It's a really fun pick, although definitely not needed in every fight. Close quarters engagements completely remove the need for spread reduction, or at the very least only require a tiny amount to comfortably land every pellet on an enemy's weak spot. Blood-Tinged Ring. Gain 2 health regeneration per second when within 25 meters of a bleeding entity. Not a bad source of flat health regen. When ran in a bleed setup, it can provide 3 health a second with triage maxed out. Since the ring specifically mentions a bleeding entity, you can apply bleeding to enemies, or have your friends nearby run a Tomenfold. You yourself could be the catalyst for proccing the ring, but keep in mind bleeding reduces your healing effectiveness by 50%. It's really not a ton of health regen, but in a dedicated bleed setup, it's a pretty nice ring. Restriction Cord. Restricts the wearer from healing above 50% of their max health and reduces all incoming damage by 15%. This is the OG half health trinket. This ring simply cuts your health in half and gives you a nice DR boost. It can also be ran with Ring of Phantom Pain to backfill your empty health bar with Grey Health, which is actually something I just learned about as I was typing this part of the script. Out of the 3 ways to maintain half health, this is probably my favorite method. Throw in Canine Keepsake, Ring of the Damned, and Ring of Crisis to have a constant source of 45% total damage, 20% crit chance, 15% crit damage, and an on-demand backup shield. It also works well with 7 out of the 8 half health amulets, Hangman's Noose being the one exception since it's an alternative to the ring. Blackout Ring. Increases reload speed by 3% for every 20% of magazine missing. Back when this was reliant on dealing base damage, it was a lot worse on anything that wasn't a single shot weapon, and even then if you missed, you still didn't get the bonus. Now that it's based on how empty the magazine is before reloading, it's far more versatile. As long as you don't tactically reload habitually, you'll get value from the ring. It pairs well with Gunslinger's utility perk and the bottom heavy mutator. Outcast Ring. Increases reload speed by 5% for 10 seconds after reloading, stacks 5 times. This ring is best used with single shot and low magazine size weapons. The nerfed duration from its original version does make it a little challenging for large capacity weapons to maintain the benefit without tactically reloading a bunch. You'll also need to reload at least 3 times for it to be as good as Blackout Ring. But in those situations where you're using Spore Shot, Widowmaker, Sure Shot, you'll be reloading pretty fast. Just keep in mind that the stacks do go away all at once. Wind Hollow Circlet. Increases reload speed by 12%. This is the most basic of this little bunch. If you tactically reload a lot, this might be the better pick for you. It doesn't provide as much as the others, but it's always there for you regardless of your playstyle. Reserve Boosting Gem. Increases health regeneration by 0.5 per second. 1 second after going below 50% health, increases regeneration value to 2.5 per second until 50% health is reached. This is a pretty solid half health trinket. 2.5 health a second places it above most other flat regen sources. Obviously, this value drops to one of the lowest when above half health, making it not the best in every other setup. It can be nice to get a decent bit of regen if you're brought low, but if you're at risk of dying in the next hit, you're probably gonna pop your relic. Singed Ring. Increases all damage dealt to burning enemies by 12%. Back when this was multiplicative, I probably would have placed it in very good. Now that it's just additive, it's alright. It can be a decent ring for miasma ritualists, or players incorporating fire dots into their build via Hotshot, Searing Wounds, or one of the many other burning dots in Remnant 2. 12% isn't a lot, but it does affect all the damage you deal to them, including said burn dots. Blasting Cap Ring. Increases explosive damage by 15%. With all of these sources that count as explosive in Remnant 2, this is a solid filler option for plenty of builds. No bells or whistles, just a basic and effective boost. The reason why it's not higher is simply because there are other sources of 15% total damage that help out in a larger variety of situations. If you want to run explosive mods, Summoner double dips its damage perk, giving you 70% more damage with them. At that point, you'd be better off investing in crit or other build utilities. And if you're running something that has blast normally built into the weapon, guess what? That weapon also has an explosive mod. Archon Summoner provides such a massive boost in power, a measly 15% won't be as impactful as, say, running Gambler for more crit chance and damage. By no means is it a bad ring, it's just one that gets overshadowed by the archetype damage bonuses. Strand of Sinew. Slows firearm charge time by 30% and increases range charge damage by 20%. The damage bonus actually applies to uncharged shots too, making it a pretty good pick for the shotgun fire on Anguish. Outside of that though, I think this is an okay choice for some charge weapons. I'm not really a fan of running this on perfect charge weapons like the bows, but on guns like Alpha/Omega and Bolt Driver, it's a bit better. You do get chunkier shots, but your DPS isn't going to be any higher. It's 30% slower charge speed for 20% more damage. In mobbing, this could actually be enough of a bonus to hit enemy health thresholds, but in bossing, you'd be better off picking any range damage ring, or, you know, Destroyer. You could make the argument that this ring belongs in weak/niche, but I think its saving grace is the aforementioned health threshold boost against trash mobs. I think if the penalty was 20 or even 15%, this would be a great pick for the weapon class. Shard Banded Ring. Increases mod damage by 12%. This is a similar case to Blasting Cap Ring. Archon and Summoner provide such a massive boost to mod damage that you really don't need to run this ring. In the early game, if you don't have Archon, it can be a nice boost, especially since it affects the elemental bullet mods. I do think it could be buffed to be at least 15% though, just like Shadestone. Even then, it would still have the same problems. Stone of Revelation increases mod generation and mod damage by 5%. Bonus is doubled against exposed targets. Funnily enough, the 5% extra mod damage versus exposed targets is multiplicative with other damage sources. The numbers are a bit low for my liking though. Make the base value 7.5% and this would be a much more enticing option in exposed builds. You could run this in a build with Echo Chamber and get some decent value out of the ring in an explosive setup, or just simply run it with Monolith. Breach Accelerator increases move speed and physical damage by 5%. Bonus is doubled when haste is active. This is an interesting ring, as it's the only source in the game that specifically boosts physical damage. Physical damage consists of white damage numbers and bleed damage. Why this ring couldn't have just been a total damage boost, I have no clue. The movement speed bonus is actually really nice though. A small damage and movement speed boost oddly makes this kind of a comfy ring to run in an abrasive rounds build. Stockpile Charger. After picking up ammo, increases the damage of that ammo type by 15% for 20 seconds. With the addition of the shovel, this ring can be kind of a fun way to boost your gun damage. If you don't run it, or one of the other methods of spawning ammo packs, you'll need to rely on ammo drops from the world to activate the ring. 15% is a nice boost, even if it only applies to the one ammo type you picked up. It works really well with the Transpose Mutator, although Transpose does last 5 less seconds than the ring, which can be a little annoying. If you can manually spawn in ammo packs, it's a solid ring. If not, you'd probably be better off with something else. Burden of the Departed. Reduces total relic charges by 33%, increases all damage dealt by 10%. This is a nice little damage boost at the cost of some of your relics. The amount removed does round down, meaning it actually takes away 4 charges from 10 max charge relics. If you don't want the range penalty of Destroyer, you could run this one, although it is only a 10% damage bonus versus the 15% from Destroyer. I also personally think the reduced relic charge penalty is harsher than the less weapon range. I also kind of wish this gave another stat on top of its damage, maybe a damage adjacent stat, like fire rate or charge speed. Stone of Expanse increases range damage by 12%, reduces all other damage dealt by 5%. My biggest gripe with this ring is that it only gives firearms with active bullet mods a 7% damage bonus. Since they count as both ranged and mod, it adds the 12% but then subtracts the 5%. This does slightly hinder the ring, as bullet mods are some of the best in the game for general gameplay. Outside of that, it is a nice bit of extra gun damage, although there are other rings I'd personally choose over this. 12% is also just kind of an awkward number. Like really, this couldn't have been 15%? Ring of Ashes. Stowed weapons generate 15 mod power per second. This ring is 50% more effective than Cataloger's Jewel when you have your melee out, since both guns count as stowed. Even then, if you have one of your weapons out, chances are you're using their mod. This gives the other weapon time to passively generate mod power as you blast away with your main. When that one's mod ends, swap to your other gun and let the first one passively generate mod power. I really like this ring, although I can definitely see some players preferring Cataloger's Jewel just for the consistent mod power generation no matter which weapon you're holding. Cataloger's Jewel automatically generates 10 mod power per second. This is the better of the two when both mods are charging. Combined with Insight, you can generate a respectable amount of mod power per second. Make sure to also invest in Spirit to gain as much as possible with both rings. Ring of Spirits increases mod generation by 3% for each active consumable, max 5 stacks. In an Alchemist Prime setup, you'll have 4 stacks of this ring consistently thanks to your concoctions. In other setups though, you can just pop the resistance consumables to achieve max stacks. It's not as much bonus mod power gen as Follower or the Spirit trait, but it's certainly better than a few other related rings on this list. Digested Hog Lure. Reloading increases mod damage by 15% for 7 seconds. This is best used in setups with elemental bullet mods on automatic weapons, or in those which have damaging mods on fast reload speed weapons. The damage boost is actually quite nice, although its short buff duration leans it into viability with only a few select weapons. You could just reload like 1 shell from the scattergun, but chances are you're going to need to fire off more than 1 to recharge whatever mod you're using. Gunslinger's Ring increases firearm swap speed by 30% and reload speed by 10%. The reload speed bonus is nice, and the swap speed feels really good on any gun build. I would say if you wanted to do a single shot swap build, Sidewinder is enough on its own. The ring encourages manual reloading and swapping at the same time. One of the best trinkets to combo with it would probably be Moonstone, although Moonstone isn't really that amazing. It's not an amazing ring, but it is one I could see many generalist gun users running. Shadestone increases skill damage by 15%. Skill damage isn't the most common nor the most sought after stat in the game. The archetypes that do have skill damage also have one or more additional damage bonuses. Unless you're building around specifically spamming as many skills as possible, you're going to want to invest into other damage types, or even just total damage bonuses like Destroyer. It's by no means a bad ring, there's just other rings out there that are better. This is a ring you could totally place into weak/niche if you really wanted to. Drain Memento. Increases max stamina by 20 and reduces encumbrance by 5. This is the estranged sibling of Heart of the Wolf. The ring provides a bonus of stamina and a very small encumbrance reduction. 20 stamina does allow players with endurance maxed out to get one more dodge roll at lightweight. However, the encumbrance reduction is very low. It could easily be 10, hell, even 15. This is another ring that could realistically be in weak, but I do find the bonus stamina to be kind of nice, even if a Mudtooth Stew is just as effective. Offering Stone. Dealing range damage increases all damage by 1% for 1 second, stacks 15 times. After killing an enemy, extends the duration to 10 seconds. This ring needs a lot of build-up that can go away really fast, especially if there are no ads around. I'd get rid of the kill requirements, increase the cap to 20, and make the stacks go down one at a time. As it stands though, it's alright. In the right scenario, it'll provide a decent damage boost to your sustained fire, and I do mean sustained, as in you'll need to run this with high mag size weapons to really gain and maintain the benefit. Band of the Fanatic. Increases status effect damage by 30% and reduces status effect duration by 50%. If you're constantly applying statuses, then it's good. It boosts all of the bullet mod dots effectively by 30% with no true downsides, at least while they're active. The status that gets hit the hardest is Overloaded, since it only procs every 5 seconds. This results in either one or more blasts being deleted by the ring. If you only apply statuses every once in a while, I'd say do not run this ring. It's also worth noting that you're reducing the duration of slow without improving its effectiveness, which is very strange. It doesn't affect the duration of exposed. Kinda weird, but still not a bad ring. There's also a pretty broken bug that exists when you unequip the ring after applying a dot. If you wanted to take that into account, you could justify bumping this ring up to a much higher spot, but outside of that, I think it's pretty decent. Firestone. Increases fire damage by 15% and fire resistance by 20. Compared to the other two elements, Shock and Corrosive, fire damage is more prevalent in both the player arsenal and enemy attacks. I've probably missed some, but I counted 14 fire, 11 shock, and 9 acid sources of player damage. By default, fire is just more prevalent. It's also better DPS-wise than Overloaded and most corrosive sources. Granted, you probably don't want to run fire damage against fire bosses, so the resistance bonus is kind of at odds with the damage buff. Still, not a bad choice for full fire builds. Jewel of the Beholden. On relic use, increase maw damage by 15% for 15 seconds. This provides slightly more than Shard Banded Ring, at the cost of using a relic every 15 seconds. I'm not a huge fan of this ring or the one coming up. The damage bonuses are nice, but I wish their buff durations were longer. The damage boosts could also honestly be increased to 20%. That would make it a bit more enticing than just getting the same boost you could get from Destroyer. Darksea Armada Crest. On relic use, increases all elemental damage dealt by 15% for 15 seconds. I have the same complaints here as with Beholden. Not bad, just not as enticing as other options. Also, unless you're running Ritualist or a triple element weapon, chances are this ring isn't going to be so worth it. You can just run a single element ring, or even one of the necklaces to gain a more consistent or more powerful specific elemental damage buff. Ring of Bones. On relic use, increases all damage by 10% for 15 seconds. This ring could honestly be buffed up to 15% with the duration being kept. I'd rather run either of the above two than this one. It does combo with Face of Danger from Challenger, which is kind of nice. Detonating Cord. On relic use, increases explosive damage by 10% for 15 seconds, and casts a 3-meter explosive AoE which deals 120 base damage. The explosive damage bonus also applies to the initial relic use blast. When combined with Tormented Heart, you deal a little over 800 damage with nothing else included. It also slightly increases the lifesteal from Tormented Heart as well. The explosive damage boost also pairs nicely with their associated builds. Not a must-have by any means, but one I would recommend if you're looking for a filler ring. Its AoE size also scales with sources that buff it. Mark of the Destroyer. Perfect dodges trigger a 3-meter AoE blast that deals 110 to 310 explosive damage. Out of the 3 AoE blast rings, this deals the highest base damage. Because of that, it doesn't provide anything else but raw damage on roll. If you want a nice boom every time you dodge roll, this is the ring for you. It can be a nice way of finishing off mobs you've weakened, plus it just sounds really cool. Frivolous Band. increases evade speed by 10%. Perfect evades increase fire rate by 10% and melee speed by 10% for 7 seconds. The evade speed bonus is nice. I just wish the buff duration wasn't nerfed. 10 seconds was already on the shorter side considering Akari lasts for 15. If you want faster evade speed, fire rate, and melee speed, just invest in haste. You can still totally run the ring, just be ready for the effect to end abruptly all the time. Power Complex. Increases all damage dealt by 1% per second up to a maximum of 15%. Dodging resets Power Complex to 0%. One aspect that kinda sucks about this ring that is not mentioned at all in its description is that there's a built-in cooldown to gaining stacks after dodging. As you would expect, this is really only worth it in face tanking setups. It's a decent damage boost, but we all know what other ring gives 15% damage at all times regardless of dodging. The time to build up this ring should be 10 seconds. 15 is an eternity in Remnant 2. Especially when you're being forced to not dodge. Burden of the Excavator. Explosions cannot critical hit. Increases explosive damage by 35%. This ring provides a sizable damage buff to explosives, but the penalty can be quite harsh. We've established how rings like Gambler are excellent in explosive builds, since they naturally can't weak spot hit. Not being able to crit can seriously hold back some weapons and mods from performing their best. The damage boost does make it really good for hitting trash mob health thresholds, but with all the other explosive buffing trinkets and prism bonuses added with the third DLC, you're sacrificing a lot of extra power for a consistent good boost. And for some players that might be totally fine. The prism grind has been significantly reduced, but I can see players who don't want to grind for Power Fantasy and Wrecking Ball picking up this ring instead. Its value is entirely dependent on what you're willing to grind for and what platform you play on. Ahane Crystal. Deal 5% additional damage for each unique status effect the target is suffering from. When this ring was multiplicative, it would have been high decent to low very good. Now that it's additive, it's alright. You need to work for it unless you're running Miasma and Ritualist though. In those setups, it's still a good pick, just not as valuable as it once was. On non-Ritualist builds, it's even less desirable, since you need to put in more effort to apply multiple status effects. Excess Coil. Activating a skill grants a shield for 25% of max health. Cannot stack with itself. Lasts 15 seconds. This ring works best with short cooldown skills. In most builds, you're probably going to have both of your skills active at the same time. However, using both back to back is a waste of the ring's effect. If the ring simply had a max of 50% for a bit longer, this would be a much better shield ring. Alternatively, make it grant a shield that could regenerate after not being damaged for a few seconds like Clear Halo, but based off of active or cooling down skills. While not amazing, it's definitely not the worst shield related ring on this list. A Terry Booster. Heavy weapons gain 10% damage and 10% critical chance in both carry mode and turret mode. This is one of the two rings that only affects the engineer archetype. Sadly, it doesn't increase the flamethrower dot or explosive damage from impact cannon's heavy carry. If it did, I'd consider it to be much better. If you are an engineer main at heart, this may be a go-to pick for you. And if you're fully invested into ammo regen via Ring of Ordnance, this ring might be good for you. Personally, I think it's alright. Maybe if I played engineer more, I'd value the ring higher. Stone of Malevolence. Elemental damage generates 15% additional mod power. When this ring was bugged, I would have probably put it in very good or excellent. Now that it's quote-unquote fixed, it's not amazing, but it does have a few setups that save it from being in weak tier. First off, let's discuss Gunfire's fix for the ring. The additional mod power generation here is like Phelan's in that it gives an additional bonus to a base percentage. However, this ring doesn't boost the base percentage of mod power generation from elemental damage dealt by weapons like Sparkfire, Enigma, Nebula, etc. Those just receive a standard mod power generation bonus. What actually receives the additional mod power generation is elemental mod damage, which by default generates 0% of its damage as mod power. As everyone knows by default, mod damage does not generate its own mod power. This unique interaction does mean mods like Witchfire, Firestorm, and Nanophase can really benefit due to their high elemental damage output. Most other mods that deal elemental damage don't deal high enough damage to make a significant impact when wearing the ring, or are considered active and can't generate mod power without also equipping Leaking Gemstone. It's certainly not bad, but nowhere near as overpowered as it used to be. Burden of the Mariner. Increases skill cooldowns by 15%. generate 15% additional mod power for each skill on cooldown. This ring has always been living in the shadows of Follower. It was buffed to grant the same bonus as Follower, and it honestly isn't that bad, but goddamn if that skill cooldown penalty doesn't suck. Granted, in some setups the penalty can be partially worked around. Skills that are active also count as being on cooldown, which is really good. Since the ring doesn't have any sort of icon on your HUD, the best way of knowing whether or not a skill will count as giving you the bonus is to check if its icon is either flashing, signifying it being active, or if it's black and white, signifying it's on cooldown. Sadly, this does mean that Engineer and Warden can't really benefit from the ring, since their skills don't really count as being active or on cooldown when they're out. Although Engineer can kind of count sometimes, I'm not entirely sure how it works, but I have checked in the Advanced Stats tab, and sometimes when you call it back it does count as being on cooldown. Nothing super reliable though. Going back to the penalty though, most archetypes are going to want their skills back as soon as possible, making that cooldown reduction feel really bad. It really isn't as bad as it used to be, it's just heavily overshadowed by Follower. Faerun Sigil. Critical and weak spot hits generate 12.5% additional mod power. Unlike its sibling ring, this one only provides a mod power generation bonus. Remnant 2 has an inconsistency problem with wording some things, damage reduction being one of them. In this case, we are faced with two different ways of wording a boost to mod power generation. Faerun Sigil and Harmonizer both list granting additional mod power generation. Both are great because they add to the base percentage of their respective mod power generation. Faerun Sigil and Burden of the Mariner state they also grant additional mod power generation, yet they actually grant the same bonus to mod power gen as Follower and Spirit. It gets a little annoying having to go back and re-edit your entire tier list because of inconsistencies in item descriptions versus their actual effects. Cough cough. Either way, this ring could absolutely buff the base mod power generation percentage, and it'd be a lot better. Symbol of Royalty. On perfect dodge, grants 1 stack of Bulwark for 10 seconds, max 3 stacks. This ring can provide 3 stacks of Bulwark simply by dodging. Sounds pretty good on paper, and if you can perfect dodge every 10 seconds, it'll serve you well. However, if you don't perfect dodge before the timer is up, all 3 stacks will disappear. That is kind of a harsh penalty. Sometimes bosses will be in transition periods where they won't attack, causing you to lose your precious 18% DR. A lot of Bulwark sources don't show timers, which can make maintaining them kind of annoying in the heat of combat, especially when varying sources have different durations. For a comparison, Hardcore Metal Band stacks drain 1 at a time. Granted, their stacks seem to have their own individual timers, but that ring can be easily procced by player damage sources like Atonement Fold and Oil Pots. Not to mention, if you're actively focused on dodging every attack, you might be better off investing in other trinkets that reward you for dodging instead, like Bypass Primer, Akari Warband, hell, even White Glass Speed may be better for you. Overall, it can be a decent bit of DR, but it's certainly not the best. If I could change the ring, I'd bump up the timer to 15 seconds and make the stack cap 4, maybe even 5. Since you could potentially lose all of your stacks at once, this could be a good ring for light setups. Fey Bruiser Ring. Dealing melee damage grants 2 stacks of Bulwark for 15 seconds, does not stack with itself. When combined with Juggernaut, you can easily max out your Bulwark stacks. Its proc condition is incredibly easy. Hell, you can even do it with thrown melees. The reason why it's down this low on the list is mainly due to the fact that maxing out Bulwark is so easy nowadays. Mostly due to the aforementioned Hardcore Metal Band, Juggernaut, Face the Danger, Sweet Leaf, you name it. Now, if you only run this ring and no other sources of Bulwark, it's technically better than something like Gall Signet. But if you already have Bulwark in your build, the DR value of the 2 additional stacks drops. At best, it grants 13% DR, and at worst, it gives 7 or even 5%. I wish Bulwark did something else besides give DR. Maybe if it was damage resistance instead of reduction, it could be interesting. I'm not entirely sure what should be done. If you have an idea of how to improve Bulwark, leave a comment down below. Dran Scavenger Ring. Collecting scrap, iron, and ammo pickups regenerates 50% of max health and increases all damage dealt by 8% for 30 seconds. I'll never forgive Gunfire for making this ring not an instant heal. Fun story, when the game came out, this ring was almost identical to how it was in Remnant 1. However, somewhere along the line, they made the healing over time instead of instant. There's no way this was intentional, as anyone who did the math would realize that 15% over 30 seconds was 0.5 regen a second, way lower than any other percentage health regen in the game. And when it got reported that it wasn't giving the instant health like it was in Remnant 1, what did they do? They just upped the percentage to 50. Whoever made the change either didn't know how to fix it or couldn't be bothered to. Either way, it's kind of embarrassing, especially when we have an instant heal in the form of fruit slices and core pellets. Why not just attach that heal mechanic to the ring? Regardless of my feelings, the ring is alright. 1.6% regen a second is pretty low, but it does last for 30 seconds, and it can be procced by the previously mentioned ammo drop sources. The damage bonus is kinda small though, it could absolutely be bumped up to at least 10%. Coal Kit Eyelet grants 1 stack of Bulwark, increases health regeneration by 0.3 per second for each stack of Bulwark. This is probably the best 1 Bulwark stack plus scalable effect ring. Achieving max Bulwark is easy enough, so getting a bit of health regen from doing so was kinda nice. Although 1.5 health a second at max stacks is still kinda low, I'd up the regen to at least 0.5, maybe even 0.6. Endira's Endless Loop. After sprinting for 1 second, the wearer gains 2 health regeneration per second until they stop sprinting. Outside of boss fights, this is a pretty comfy regen ring. Inside boss fights, however, you're essentially trading your precious stamina for health at a disproportionate rate. I honestly think the delay could be removed entirely, and since it relies on sprinting as long as possible to maintain the regen, I think the flat value could be bumped up to 4. With triage, it'd become 6, and if you grabbed Physician from the Prism system, you'd be healing 10 health a second while sprinting. At 6 health a second, you'd still need to run around for 20 plus seconds to fully heal, although when combined with other regen sources it would be pretty good. Clear Halo. After 10 seconds of not being damaged, generate a shield for 10% of max health over 2 seconds. The best part about this ring is that it provides you with an infinite duration shield. The only problem is that the cooldown after being hit is very long. Not to mention 10% shield is lower than any other ring maximum. I'd honestly rather run one of the other shield rings. If the cooldown were 5 seconds and the max shield 15, I'd value it much higher. Blood Jewel. Charged melee attacks apply bleeding, dealing 620 bleed damage over 20 seconds. This ring has decent bleed duration, but not so good bleed damage. If you're using other bleed trinkets like Blood Tinged Ring or Abrasive Whetstone, you can just run a firearm with Twisting Wounds, or throw a pipe bomb. In a pure melee setup with nothing else though, it can be kind of helpful. Vampire Blade pairs very well with the ring. Besides that, there's not much else to say about it. I do think the bleed damage could be upped a little bit. Either that or give some sort of other bonus for attacking bleeding targets. Kinetic Cycle Stone increases mod and skill cast speed by 20%. It goes without saying, if you want cast speed, you're just gonna invest in Flashcaster. 20% more is noticeable, but you can just spend the 10 points. Hell, just spend 4 and save the ring slot. That being said, extra cast speed does make certain skills perform way better. Havoc Form's attack speed scales with the stat, and skills like Redemption become far less risky the more cast speed you have. Flashcaster may be the strongest source of cast speed, but this ring can help push some skills a little further. Unfortunately, some skills also have a cap to their speed. Redemption specifically has an 80% speed cap. Instead of fixing the issue where the skill got stuck, they just prevent it from benefiting past 80%. This does make the ring less valuable than it otherwise would be. Also, this ring should be at least 30%. When the fragment is giving as much as the ring, you know something's off. Transient Cord. On relic use, increases critical chance by 10% and critical damage by 10% for 15 seconds. Reduce bonus by 1% once every 1.5 seconds. This ring is a good example of crit chance and damage not always making a ring automatically good. This ring in concept isn't bad, but the effect is true to its name. A little too true if you ask me. The effect draining from the first second means you're never even going to experience the max bonus to a significant degree. I think all this ring needs is a 5-second grace period at the start that gives you the full bonus. After the grace period ends, it can start tapering off. This ring would see so much more use if it even had a tiny window to experience its full power. The best case scenario where this ring is honestly really good is in a chef metal setup, since you can just proc the effect without the need to constantly pop relics. Would my suggested buff make it even stronger with chef metal? Yes, but good luck using it outside of that combo. It's by no means a bad ring, just one that needs a slight tweak in my opinion. Ravager's Bargain. Increases all damage and all critical chance by 5% while bleeding. I considered placing this ring in weak for a good while. It requires you to be bleeding to gain the benefit, meaning you need to run Atonement Fold, or have a friend shoot you with abrasive rounds or twisting wounds. The only reason why I don't just slap it down there is the fact that it has a small crit chance boost. Like Zohe's ring, if I made this list again, I would probably move it down a tier. To fix this ring, I'd honestly make it like Breach Accelerator, and make the effect base and then be doubled while bleeding. You would still need to run Atonement Fold for it to function, but it'd be far more worth it. Tolerance Band decreases firearm charge time by 10% and increases perfect charge window for applicable ranged weaponry. This ring is sort of like training wheels for charge weapons. Inherently, it's an unnecessary ring by design for competent players. The charge speed bonus is kind of nice, but it gets outclassed by every other charge speed boosting source. If this ring buffed the perfect shot damage bonus, then we'd be in business. Ring of Diversion increases invulnerability window while evading and sliding. It's not mentioned in the description, but it actually grants 2 iframes to all evasions. This feels like a ring where you either love it and swear by it, or dislike it and don't need it. For the longest time, I never used it, mainly because it doesn't display how much it affects your dodge window in the description. Thankfully, we can see how much it gives in the Advanced Stats tab, which begs the question why it's not listed in the description. I mean, come on, Gossamer Heart does it, why not this ring? This same complaint applies to every evade window source that doesn't list their values. But what about the ring itself? Well, it grants you 2 more iframes by wearing it. For an example of how many iframes you get by default, I'll put up a list of comparisons. Light rolls have 12 iframes, meaning this ring raises it to 14. Untouchable from Invader increases your evade window by 30%. And if I am reading the wiki correctly, it should be a multiplier to a weight class's evade window value. Light rolls have a 0.4 evade window, which when increased by 30% becomes 0.52. We then multiply this value by 30 to get our new total amount of iframes, which is 15.6. Thankfully, iframes do actually round to the nearest integer, which means the trait gives light rolls 16 iframes, a 4-frame difference. Ring of Diversion gives half of that, although it is also affected by Untouchable, becoming 2.6, rounding up to 3 extra iframes when wearing the ring and with the trait invested. When you combine every iframe source from consumables to Gossamer Heart, you really do feel the increased invulnerability. On its own though, it may not be as noticeable. Still, not a bad ring by any means. Ring of the Castaway increases base consumable duration by 50%. Maybe some people would place this lower due to potency being a trait, but it's honestly kind of a guilty pleasure ring for me. Being able to make rocket fuel and confidence booster last 50 seconds feels really good. Obviously, this isn't super necessary though. If the game had a true survival mode like Remnant 1, this would have a much better use case. Concoctions already last 2 hours with potency. Unless you're trying to save on scrap or don't have access to potency yet, I wouldn't really recommend running this ring. Dried Clay Ring grants 1 stack of Bulwark, increases all damage by 50% of the total damage reduction granted by Bulwark stacks. On its own, it grants 7% DR and a 3.5% total damage boost. Not particularly amazing, but also technically better than Lithic Signet. At max Bulwark, it provides a 12.5% total damage boost. Again, not terrible, but there are so many other rings out there that can provide more for less effort. Say you're running Juggernaut on Challenger. If you pop a Relic, for the next 10 seconds you'll be maxed out on Bulwark stacks. Alternatively, you could use a Sweet Leaf and get your 5th stack from getting up with Die Hard. These rings that give 1 stack of Bulwark aren't needed for their stack. You're going to be running them for their scalable effect. If the effect isn't impactful, then why not run something else with a similar effect? Ring of Infinite Damage increases fire rate by 8%. This is meant to be a joke ring, but I do kinda wish it was a little better. If it also buffed melee speed and maybe move speed, I would honestly see this becoming a comfort ring for many Gunfu players. Obviously, if you want more fire rate, reload speed, and literally every other action in the game, just invest in haste. That being said, this is effectively an 8% DPS boost on gun builds. It's entirely up to you how worth it that is, but since the addition of Perception, this ring really isn't that amazing. Lighthouse Keeper's Ring. Automatically generate 4 mod power per second for each entity within 15 meters suffering from a negative status effect. Max 5 stacks. Since the effect is based off of nearby entities, you and your allies can be proccing sources for the ring. In a Miasma Ritualist setup, this can be a decent pick for mod power generation, especially in boss rush mode. You can use some select mods like Witchfire, Firestorm, Flying Bomb Trap, and Heatwave to constantly have entire groups nailed with status effects. I still prefer other passive mod gen trinkets, but I can totally see an argument for this being higher up and decent. Feedback Loop. Perfect dodges trigger a 3-meter AoE blast that deals 55 to 155 shock damage and applies Overloaded, which deals 55 to 155 shock damage every 5 seconds. This ring could honestly go in weak tier. The blast and Overloaded dot deal pretty pitiful damage. It's only indecent since it can proc sources like Nightweaver's Grudge pretty easily. Overloaded is just so weak in Remnant 2 compared to the first game. If you want to apply Overloaded to a group of people, just run Voltaire Grandeur. If I were to change the ring, I would honestly just overhaul Overloaded. But for the sake of simplicity, I would just make the AoE way larger. Make it like 5, 6, maybe even 8 meters. I kind of like the idea of this ring of the 3 explosion rings having the largest AoE, giving it something unique over the others. After that massive section, we are now moving on to weak/niche. As I mentioned before, these rings are either severely outclassed or have some sort of caveat holding them back. Stone of Balance increases all damage by 7%. This is the peak of mediocrity. By design, Stone of Balance kinda has to be weak, at least compared to the rest of the damage rings in Remnant 2. If you buff this ring, you'll have to buff a ton of others. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen, there's just a lot to account for in the grand scheme of Remnant 2 balance. Vestige of Power. After 5 seconds of not being damaged, increases ranged and melee damage by 10%. I really wish this ring was all damage, and that it gave a little bit more. There are countless other rings that give all damage, or at least more ranged and melee that don't go away when you get hit. 5 seconds is fine, but the benefits need to be higher. In the first game, I loved the Ring of Supremacy. I think if they leaned into making it all damage, as well as bumped up the numbers, it'd be a more popular ring. Mechanics Cog. While carrying an engineer heavy weapon, gain 15% movement speed and 1 stack of bulwark. This is the second of the 2 engineer restricted rings, and this one isn't super necessary in my mind. At the very least with a Terry booster, you're getting damage and crit chance with your engineer skills in general. This ring only applies when in heavy carry mode. While I do like the move speed bonus, if you need to get somewhere fast, you're probably just gonna drop the gun and run. And if threats are getting too close for comfort, you don't even need to run away either. Heavy carry mode has 1 more iframe and a 7% faster recovery time than light rolling, meaning you're actually safer dodge-wise when holding these huge hunks of machinery than someone wearing nothing. Your evade distance may be shorter, but the faster recovery time means you can dodge again sooner. So what about the stack of bulwark you also gain? Well, as any engineer main can tell you, holding your heavy weapons procs the archetype's team perk, which increases your DR by 15%, making the stack of bulwark not nearly as attractive. So even if this ring lets you move faster and become a bit tankier, the base mode doesn't need those. Here are my ideas for changing not only Mechanics Cog, but a Terry booster as well. First, make them both generally apply to all Neuridian tech. That way Warden's drone is also affected by them. Second, replace the move speed bonus with a fire rate bonus. This would affect the attack speed and rearming time of both the combat drone and heavy carry weapons. Lastly, switch out the bulwark stack for an exposed application on dealing Neuridian tech damage. This could be like echo chambers 5 seconds per hit up to 15 seconds. This would shift up the ring multiple tiers in my book. Extra attack speed and applying exposed would be amazing for both archetypes. It would allow engineer and warden players to utilize the 3 exposed rings, adding even more variety to their builds. Alumni Ring. Increases all elemental damage dealt by 10%. This ring can be kind of decent in ritualist setups. If you happen to be running 2 elemental weapons, it can also be an alright pick. As with all elemental damage buffs, it increases direct elemental damage and elemental dot damage. It doesn't affect bleed damage though. As we've established earlier with Breach Accelerator, it's considered physical. This is another ring in a similar vein to Stone of Balance. It's inherently going to be lower than all the other active sources, which I think is a good balance philosophy for a game like Remnant, and many other numbers games for that matter. If you are going to have a set of items that buff the same things, the ones that do so passively with no trade-off or activation condition should be weaker than those that do have them. It's why I think rings like Jewel of the Beholden, Darksea Armada Crest, and Ring of Bones should be better. When a ring that has a fairly inconsequential downside like Destroyer provides the same or better effect than these rings, that for the average non-medic player has a steeper cost, that being using a relic, it's a sign something's gone wrong. Mini rant aside, my main point is that this ring, Stone of Balance, and a few others in this section need to be weaker by design to allow the more risky and involved ones to rise up. So if this ring was to get changed, the ones above would need to be as well. Black Pawn Stamp. Reduces cooldowns of skills by 10%. Back before the 3rd DLC, I would have put this near the bottom of decent, but now with access to 20% via the Prism system, it's far less desirable. Still, it does its job, and can be a serviceable filler ring in any setup. White's Pawn Stamp. Reduces mod power requirements by 10%. Just run Leaky Gemstone. Reaction Chain is also fantastic for looping mods. Mod cost really isn't that big of an issue anymore, especially since over time many mods have been made cheaper. You're honestly better off going with a mod generation ring like Follower if you want to build them faster. If I were Gunfire, I'd probably buff this to 15 or even 20%. That would be a substantial amount. And yes, it would be a bigger cost reduction than even what Archon provides, but let's be honest, Archon's fine. Plus, a change like this would make the ring worth running in a variety of setups. Soul Feast. When a human, companion, or minion is downed or killed, reduce skill cooldowns by 8%. This can be a very fun pick in a Challenger Summon or Warstomp build, where you use your hollows to get your chargers back faster, and if your friends go down, it can be a nice way of speeding up longer cooldown skills like Redemption or Elixir of Life. I think upping the value to 15% could help push the ring's effect to be useful outside of just a sacrifice setup. This would mean you'd be getting even more value out of said playstyle, but considering you already have to be dedicating one of your skills to be a battery bank for the other, it's not really that outlandish. Also, Devloop can grant both of your skills effectively unlimited uptime, and, exists. Wired Inhibitor. Applying a negative status effect on an enemy also applies slow for 1 second. Applying or refreshing additional negative statuses will increase the duration by 1 second, max 5 seconds. Unlike Time Weaver, this ring's slow effect does not scale with status duration. The effect goes away so quickly you might as well just run Time Weaver instead. Hell, just throw a Binding Orb at a crowd. It can be okay on innate elemental weapons like Sparkfire, Enigma, Nebula, Hellfire, etc., although I think the ring should absolutely scale with status effect duration. Momentum Driver. After sprinting for 1.5 seconds, movement speed is increased by 15% and stagger level reduced by 1. Juggernaut Band returns from Remnant 1, and in this game it's not as valuable as it was in, say, Survival Mode. Remnant 2 has Boss Rush, but you need to actively kill things in the pre-boss room to progress. Unless you're trying to speedrun that game mode, you aren't going to be using this ring outside of running it in Survivor difficulty to run past everything in the campaign or adventure mode. I'm not even sure how or if I would buff this ring. Ever since Confidence Booster was nerfed, this ring has become a bit more valuable for the stagger reduction. Then again, we still have Stone Mist and Juggernaut as methods for reducing stagger, and for those dedicated enough, there's the legendary bonus that makes you immune to being staggered while having Bulwark. Nanofiber Strand. Increases shield amount by 10%. This is another ring that can't really be buffed much without needing to touch the other sources around it. I've mentioned it previously in this video, but if there's one thing I think should be really changed, it's fragments giving the same or higher bonuses than rings. The shield max and duration fragments both give 10%. This ring by default needs to give either one better or both of them. We already have a 15% shield ring in the form of Protector, so we might as well just throw shield duration on the ring instead. Obviously more could be done, it's just a matter of thinking of some cool new effects to add to the ring. Rock of Anguish. Gain 5% movement speed and 7.5% reload speed for every 25% of max health missing. This ring is obviously meant to be used by glass cannon builds, however I really think they should take a page from the Hell mods change and make the ring gain 1 stack every 24.20 health so that you gain 4 stacks at 1 HP. 20% move speed and 30% reload speed would be pretty damn good for a ring, and a fitting bonus considering a slight breeze could kill you. As it stands, it's a niche ring for a niche playstyle. Blessed Ring. After receiving a benefit from a relic, gain 2 stacks of Bulwark for 30 seconds. Even after being buffed to last 30 seconds, it's still not amazing. I think this ring could honestly be changed to grant pure DR instead of Bulwark, or be given a scalable Bulwark buff like some of the other rings. How about every stack of Bulwark grants an additional 10 armor? This would become a pretty nice pick for Daredevil and lighter armor setups. 50 armor is nothing to scoff at least on these sets that already don't have a ton of it. Defensive Action Ring. While reloading, and for 3 seconds after reload completes, incoming damage is reduced by 10%. This ring would be better if it also gave -1 stagger during reload. DR isn't uncommon to come by in the ring slot, and while reloading is an easy action that can be controlled, it's just as easy to dodge while reloading. The best use case of this ring is when you're running really slow reloading guns. The only problem is that getting hit while reloading cancels it. If the ring also gave a level of stagger reduction while reloading, it would be better at the playstyle it encourages. Embrace of Shahala. Wearer gains 7.5% incoming damage reduction when suffering from a unique status effect or blight, max 2 stacks. Thanks to Oil Pots and Atonement Fold, we can easily gain both stacks permanently. Unfortunately, there are other DR sources out there that are just better. This ring is by no means bad, just severely outclassed. Wearing Atonement Fold does mean you'll need to rely on lifesteal or invest into triage to negate the healing penalty bleeding places on you. If we had a method of applying Overloaded to us, this ring could be a bit easier to work with. Conjurer Circle. When the wearer summons enters the battlefield, conjure a 5-meter summoning circle. Allies in the summoning circle have their stagger level reduced by 1 and regenerates 5 gray health per second. Lasts 10 seconds. Can only happen once every 10 seconds after expiring. The idea of this ring is awesome. However, the duration and cooldown hold it back from being a great summoner tool. My suggestion for this ring is to make the circle stay on the ground permanently until you resummon. The small area it casts restricts your effective space, meaning if whatever you're fighting moves, you're SOL for 20 seconds as you're forced to wait for the circle to dissipate and then come off cooldown. Just get rid of the cooldown, make it last until you resummon, and this ring would be way better. Security half measure. On relic use, sacrifices 15% of max health and grants a shield for 10% of the wearer's max health to allies within 8 meters. Conversion cannot kill wearer. Lasts 15 seconds. The shield given to allies does scale with the wearer's max health. It's also affected by shield amount and duration sources, but not AoE sources. The health sacrificed is converted to grey health, which means it can proc Necklace of Flowing Life. It also counts as self-damage, and while it's not reduced by kinship, it does proc sources like Hardcore Metal Band. While a cool concept, there are simply better ways of shielding your friends. The small AoE, coupled with the frankly pitiful amount of shield, makes the ring severely outclassed. I think a simple way of fixing this ring would be to make the shield amount 25% and not of the wearer's max health, but rather the target's max health. As it stands right now, this ring is pretty much useless for shielding your summons. Also, the AoE should totally scale. Power Saver. At max health, gain a 35% chance to not use a relic charge. Outside of some medic shenanigans, this ring is very niche. It works best with relics that either don't heal, or ones that do heal but want to be used when you're at full health, like Resonating or Decayed Heart. With those relics, you can potentially have far more charges, especially when running Redeemer. However, there are other methods of attaining unlimited relic charges, like Emergency Switch, Curry Charm, Conservation Seal, Medic. It's kind of an unnecessary ring, but I can't deny it can help you pull off some funny plays with teammates. If I were to change it, I'd reward players for using relic charges at max health even if they lose the dice roll. I'd make the ring grant a stackable 5% global crit chance bonus for 20 seconds. It'd stack up to 3 times. Since you would have to be at max health to gain the effect, this would not be cheesable via Emergency Switch plus Conservation Seal. The crit chance boost would be very nice, however, you would need to waste relic charges to maintain it, making this ring most effective in the hand of confident players, or those who play medic. Ring of Deflection. Direct damage against a wearer has a 50% chance to be converted entirely to grey health. I almost considered placing this ring in Decent, mainly due to it having great combo potential with bandages and salvage art. Unfortunately, there are far better methods of gaining grey health out there. While I am glad they buffed the chance to 50%, I think this ring could still use a little something extra to help it when it doesn't win the coin toss. Give this ring a bonus 30% extra grey health conversion, and it'd be a bit better. Ring of the Vein. Reduces invulnerability window on evade and combat slide by 35%, increases movement speed while aiming by 35%. This is one of the few rings I think I'm fully fine with just being a niche ring. It provides a good bonus to ADS move speed at the cost of some iframes. Players that prefer dodging won't use it as it can throw off muscle memory, but players that want to be able to sidestep attacks can run this ring and feel really fast doing so. If anything, I think this ring could be buffed to be 50%, making the combination of this ring and footwork or sidewinder help players hit the move speed cap effortlessly. Vacuum Seal. Increases automatic pickup range for scrap by 150%. Picking up scrap, iron, or ammo grants a shield for 15% of max health for 15 seconds. Does not stack. For general exploration, this is actually a very comfy ring. The increased scrap pickup range is very noticeable. The shield gain is quite nice as well. And with the previously mentioned methods of spawning ammo pickups, you can have it up very frequently. The reason why I rate it so low is because of all the other shield rings I've covered so far. Think back to all the various methods of gaining shield, ones that are easier to proc or grant more total shield. Compared to every other shield ring, this is the hardest to work with. Not to imply the act of picking up scrap, iron, or ammo is hard, it's just dependent on where and when you use it. Like I mentioned in the beginning, this ring is nice when you're just exploring around dungeons and the overworld. Inside boss fights, however, it relies purely on ammo boxes to sustain itself. Every other shield ring just needs you to shoot your gun, dodge, spend stamina, use a skill, etc. The only thing I'd probably change about this ring is the duration. If it lasted 30 seconds to match with the Dran Scavenger ring, that would be awesome. It'd make exploring with the ring even more comfy. And it'd be the longest lasting non-perma shield source for boss fights. Fey Shaman Ring. increases health regeneration by 0.35, and relic use speed by 25%. Both parts of this ring are done better by previous ones on this list. First off, that regen. It's so low. If you want health regen, there are so many ways of doing so. Regrowth, blood roots, blood-tinged ring, root water, etc, etc. Then there's the relic use speed bonus. Celerity Stone provides consumable and relic use speed. Glutton also provides a 35% bonus to both, making this ring's half coverage even less appealing. Feeding Tube with a source of blood roots effectively takes both bonuses and performs way better, albeit with the trade-off of more health regen for less use speed. I think it could be more interesting if it were reworked into an on-relic use type ring. Make the relic use speed bonus 30%, and the on-relic use grant the player 2 health regen for 15 seconds. This would match up perfectly with Tranquil Heart's duration, and be a great way of working the two halves of the ring together. Rusted Heirloom. Grants 2 stacks of Bulwark when below half HP. With how easy it is to gain Bulwark stacks nowadays, and the amount of decent half-health trinkets we have in our collection, this ring's name is really accurate to what it's become at this point in R2's history. A relic of the past that we keep around that isn't as nice as it used to be, and even back then it wasn't particularly amazing. If you want defense at half health, run Broken Heart and Hardened Coil. Or just Hardened Coil and Restriction Cord. 2 stacks of Bulwark below half health is at best 13% DR. Like most of the pure Bulwark items that grant nothing else, I think this could stand to receive a scalable buff per stack of it. It could give like 2% crit chance per stack of Bulwark. This would make it an enticing half health ring, and while you could just use Challenger to achieve max Bulwark without going below half health, at that point you could just run Braided Thorns. Guardian's Ring. Adds 1 stack of Bulwark when within 15 meters of an enemy. Increases to 2 stacks for 15 seconds after taking melee damage. The AoE is affected by Amplitude, which is nice, although the requirement to be hit by a melee attack is not as nice. Not every boss has a melee attack, or at least one that gets used once every 15 seconds. Did I mention you need to be hit to get this ring's full effect? If I wanted a ring that rewards me with Bulwark for being hit, I'd go with Hardcore Metal Band. I think an interesting buff to this ring would be to grant a passive 10% melee damage resistance while equipped. Being a resistance, it would reduce your damage taken even further if you were at the DR cap. That, and it'd be nice to see the ring's effect from the first game partially reintroduced, as I was quite fond of it back then. Lithic Signet. Reduces all incoming damage by 7%. I can definitely see people arguing for this ring to be placed in Terrible, but if I'm being honest, I have a soft spot for it. While a single stack of Bulwark gives the same amount, every stack past it is worse than the ring. And 1 stack can be easily gained by popping a Sweet Leaf. As for other DR sources in the ring slot, Gull Signet is worse than this ring at heavy and ultra weights. And if you want to be above half health, this is your next best source of passive DR in the ring slot. The DR Fragment only provides 5% as well, making this ring ever so slightly better in that regard. Now of course Barkskin, Fortify, and sources of max health are always going to be better than what this ring can provide. However, when taking all the situations I brought up into consideration, I can't genuinely rate this ring that poorly. Dreadfont. Increases Grey Health regeneration rate by 2 per second. When combined with Bloodstream and other Grey Health conversion items, it can be a nice boost. In the early game, it can absolutely save your life when you're low on heals. It unfortunately gets beaten out by other Grey Health options like Rally Band or Ring of Phantom Pain. I think a nice buff to the ring would be adding an additional hit before losing Grey Health. If you ran this with Medic and Effigy Pendant, you'd be able to take 4 hits before losing Grey Health, 5 if you also ran Numbing Agent. Grounding Stone. Increases shock damage by 15% and shock resistance by 20. You want to know how many sources of shock damage are in Remnant 2 boss fights? 5, and at least one of them I know is unintentional. On the player side, shock damage is a bit more prevalent than acid, making this ring by default more useful than Acid Stone. I still wouldn't really consider running this ring unless I was doing some sort of electrician build with Havoc form, and even then, there are better rings out there if you're looking for superior skill damage. I believe an interesting addition for all 3 elemental rings would be to provide immunity to their associated elemental status effects. They'd still be pretty niche, but the ability to prevent something like corrosion from being applied to you would be kinda cool. The other solution would be to increase the amount of elemental attacks used by enemies. Perhaps some existing moves could have elemental damage added on top of their physical output. This would give players a solid reason to invest in elemental resistance. A change like that would be best suited for higher difficulties though, via some sort of modifier system for the campaign and adventure mode. Acid Stone. Increases acid damage by 15% and acid resistance by 20. You want to know how many sources of acid damage are in Remnant 2 boss fights? 3, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Corrosive Dots delete your Grey Health and reduce your DR by 10%. Even after the buffs, I would still say it's the weakest of the elemental rings outside of some niche setups. Metal Driver. Killing blows increase reload speed by 10% for 15 seconds, stacks 3 times. this ring can be okay outside of bossing. That sentiment applies to pretty much all of the on-kill rings in this section. I definitely think they're more valuable now since we have boss rush, as before your best bet using them was for dungeon and overworld mobbing, and the occasional boss fight with easily accessible ads. I personally consider this one to be the best of the bunch. The 15-second duration that gets refreshed on kill can actually help in some boss fights, and is practically guaranteed to be always up when in the mobbing sections of boss rush. It's still limited by being an on-kill ring though. One change that I think would be great for this ring would be making it lose only one stack at a time. You would still need to kill in order to maintain the buff, but 15 seconds passing won't mean needing to start over. Ring of Restocking. Reloads within 5 seconds of a critical kill or weak spot kill are 20% faster. This ring's short duration means you can't hold off reloading for long after getting a crit or weak spot kill, lest you lose your bonus altogether. Single shot and semi-auto weapons work pretty well at landing those specific killing blows so long as you aim well. Automatic weapons require a bit more aim restraint or investment into crit chance to get the bonus. One aspect of the ring I'm not a fan of is that the buff is consumed on reload. Even if you could reload and fire multiple times within 5 seconds, no can do. Using this ring just makes me wish I was running Blackout or Outcast ring instead. Those ones don't rely on getting kills to speed up my reloads. And if I was using automatic weapons, I could just use Wind Hollow Circlet to tactically reload whenever I wanted to. I could also just run Overflow for a fire rate and reload speed boost. If I could change the ring, I'd make critical and weak spot hits grant stacks that increase your reload speed. Critical and weak spot kills would still give the max amount of stacks. Let's say crits and weak spot hits grant 1 stack each. 2 if it's both a critical and weak spot hit. 1 stack would give 1% reload speed. With all stacks being consumed on reload, this change would still allow single shot weapons to gain the full benefit on weak spot and crit kills, while also enabling semi-auto and automatic weapons to be viable choices while running the ring. I must admit I'm kinda proud of this idea. Compulsion Loop. After killing an enemy, gain 5% fire rate and melee attack speed for 10 seconds, stacks 3 times. At max stacks, the bonus fire rate and melee speed do feel really good. Unfortunately, the short duration and constant reliance on getting kills does lend its usefulness to mostly mobbing. When you can pop a light extract and gain 10% faster everything, this ring really falls to the wayside. My suggestion here is the same as metal drivers. Make the stacks drain 1 at a time, and also maybe increase the bonus to 6%. These changes alone would make the ring far more attractive. Propulsion Loop. After killing an enemy, increases movement speed by 5% and consumable use speed by 10% for 10 seconds, stacks 3 times. Take my compliments, complaints, and stack loss suggestion from Compulsion Loop and apply them here too. This one is more of the same, and it's kind of a shame because I really like move speed rings. Combat Shield Generator. While in combat, crouching or combat slide generates a stationary 3 meters by 1.5 meters energy shield with 700 health which blocks enemy projectiles, lasts 10 seconds or until broken by damage, can only happen once every 10 seconds after expiring. In the right situations, this ring can save your life. Unfortunately, some things just pass right through the shield. It's also super tiny, and the cooldown is very long. I'd rather have the duration and cooldown cut in half so you could use it in bursts. Alternatively, I'd like to see it be changed to follow the user while crouching, similar to those shields from Borderlands 3. The shield would regain health while undeployed, like a Rhine shield from Overwatch. Overall, it's a really neat concept, held back by the design and mechanics of the wall mod from the base game. Focusing Shard. Aiming down sights gradually reduces spread by 70% over 4 seconds. The amount of time you need to ADS to receive the ring's full benefit is way too long. Not to mention if you stop aiming, your bonus goes away completely. In co-op, this isn't as bad, since your allies can take aggro as you tighten the spread. Solo play, however, makes this ring situational at best, and useless at worst. It's a cool ring concept, although I do miss when it also reduced recoil. I'd say bring that aspect back, make the spread reduction 45% over 1.5 seconds. When combined with handling and the concoction, you could max spread reduction pretty easily. Alternatively, take a shot every time I've said that this tier list, you could just make the ring grant stacks when aiming down sights and lose those stacks over a few seconds when not aiming. Stone of Continuance. Increases skill duration by 15%. When this ring gave 25%, I would have considered it very good, but at 15%, it's honestly fairly weak. The second DLC brought Invoker, and more importantly, gifted to the table for build making. That trait alone gives 30%. This ring could have honestly stayed at 25%, or at the very least been nerfed to just 20%. When the fragments is giving as much as the rings, there is a problem. Either buff it up to 20%, or give it another bonus related to skills. Amber Moonstone. When health drops below 35%, all incoming damage is reduced by 25%, and wearer becomes immune to temporary status effects. On half-health builds, this can be a decent pick. It's definitely more of a safety net than a true tanking ring though. The best part about the ring is that it can prevent scenarios where you survive an attack that nearly kills you, but a dot finishes you off. On Apocalypse difficulty, if you're at or below 35% health and get hit by one more thing,
you're probably dead!
It's easier than ever to hit the DR cap too, what with the prism buffs to the DR and armor legendary bonuses. If the ring activated at 50% health, it'd be far better. The damage reduction value could be adjusted if deemed necessary, although at half health it could honestly stay. That kind of difference could actually let you occasionally tank an extra hit on a non-dedicated tank build. Band of Accord. Ammo acquired on pickup is increased by 50% per ally also wearing this ring, and is shared with other allies. In the early game, this can be a very comfy ring for co-op. In the mid to late game, however, ammo boxes become far more plentiful, making the ability to split ammo pickups not that desirable. It can enable some shenanigans with teammates running the transpose mutator though, and for that alone, I can't give it any lower than weak. Tomb Dweller's Ring. Increases movement speed by 10% for 15 seconds after vaulting, climbing, leaping, and entering water. Stacks 3 times. Reduces fall damage by 50%. This ring provides a huge boost to movement speed outside of boss fights. There are some arenas where you can proc the ring by leaping. However, chances are you won't have much space to move around after jumping though. For general traversal, it's easily the best ring for getting around. The fall damage reduction, albeit a bizarre stat to have on a ring, is actually kind of nice when you're just speeding through an adventure. The one thing I would suggest would be to allow slides to proc the ring as well. That way it could be used in all sorts of environments. Now, would this change make the Seaver's Band a little bit less valuable? A little bit, yeah, but that ring also grants evade speed. Burden of the Mesmer. Reduces max health by 20%. Increases all damage by 1% for every 5% of the wearer's total damage reduction. I am really not a fan of this ring or the next one coming up. Both encourage you to wear the heaviest armor and stack as many sources of DR as possible to gain their full benefits. Mesmer provides at most 20% increased total damage. That is a good boost, but the health penalty blows massively. It's a percentage too, not a flat amount, meaning the ring's downside scales with your max health. On Apocalypse, that's a really harsh penalty. It wouldn't be as bad if you didn't have to work for the upside after equipping it. It's like being given a set of keys to a treasure chest with a ton of locks after having all of your fingers removed. Yeah, you'll get it open eventually, but why the hell did you chop my fingers off? Also, the chest has like 50 bucks in it tops. Out of all the burden rings in the game, why do these two have an extra stipulation to their upside? The ring could just be lose 20% max health, gain 20% more damage, and people would probably use it. This would make it a straight upgrade to Ring of the Admiral. However, that ring is clearly meant to be a challenge option, so buffing Mesmer wouldn't be the worst. Burden of the Mason. Decreases dodge weight threshold by 25. Increases melee damage by 35% of the wearer's total damage reduction. This ring's penalty isn't nearly as harsh as Mesmer's, however, I still think the user shouldn't need to stack DR to gain the upside. I also believe the effect should be changed. We already have a ring that increases melee damage based on encumbrance. I think it would be interesting to give this ring the opposite of Mesmer's penalty. 20% more health would make it the largest single source of percentage max health in the game. It'd provide a huge boost to every flat max health source, Vigor, Tonic, the legendary bonus, etc. You could run this new version to counteract the penalty from Mason, but you could also just use a different damage ring in its place like Destroyer if you don't want to suffer the health penalty. Custodian's Bastion. Increases armor by 1 per 2% of active shield. Max 100 bonus armor. Conceptually, this ring is kind of cool. It rewards your use of shields by granting you additional armor while they're up. This lets your shield potentially take more damage. However, the major problem comes with how shields work. Shield sources effectively grant players a temporary health boost based off their max HP. If I have 130 health, Shielded Heart will give me 130 temporary health for 20 seconds. Shields also benefit from damage reduction just like our health. So why is this ring not that good? The answer for 90% of cases will be diminishing returns. Using the lightest armor set, Bandit with Fortify provides 29 armor DR. When you throw in Custodian's Bastion with a full shield, this becomes 43.9% armor DR. This is the best gain you'll receive from the ring in an average setup. It could be higher if you run other total armor bonuses, but let's continue on for now. The average source of shields in Remnant 2 grants 15 to 25%, with some exceptions here and there in the form of rings, relics, archetype effects, etc. This means the ring's effectiveness is heavily dependent on which sources of shield you use. Something like Tightly Wound Coil will only provide you with a few points of armor, which will do about as much as a bulletproof vest full of paper. This becomes even worse when you run bigger and more protective armor sets. Due to Remnant 2's armor calculation, 50 armor won't be as good with Litos as it would be with one of the lighter sets. Now you might ask yourself, hey, this ring says it goes up to 100 armor, how do you gain the other half of the bonus? Well, it requires running the legendary bonus, Defensive Measures. And at that point, you might as well run Steel Plating for the constant 150 armor. And for the final nail in this ring's coffin is anti-DR attacks. Some moves in Remnant 2 just straight up ignore DR. Unless you study up on the toolkit's boss damage page, you aren't going to know what those are. This ring does not help with them. The only way to deal with them is to stack pure health and shields, and even then, you should just avoid them where possible. Now, with all of that out of the way, what do we do to make this ring better? I believe converting it to a while shields are active ring is the way to go. This ring can still give armor. I think it should just provide a flat amount of armor, no matter how much shield you have. Make it 50 flat with any amount of shield, and make the effect last for 5 seconds after your shield ends. This would become a great defensive option for many lighter armor sets. The short duration after a shield ends or breaks would help protect against any immediate follow-up attacks. Ring of the Forest Spirit. Relic healing effectiveness is increased by 15%. This ring provides a very small boost to relic healing abilities. 15% is the same bonus as Medic's team perk, which sounds decent on paper, but is outclassed by other trinkets like Conservation Seal and Nimue's Ribbon. If you're looking for more relic healing, Triage and Ribbon are all you really need, with Physician being there for insane people. Spirit Stone. Increases mod power generation by 10%. This ring is severely outclassed by every other mod power generation ring. I have never once in my life actually legitimately considered using this in any build. Make it an additional generation bonus like Fey Rin Sigil, and throw in a 5% mod crit boost and players will flock to the ring. Spirit Alternator. Incoming shield grants 150% of the shield generated as mod power. The mod power generated by this ring does scale with the increased max shield bonus from Defensive Measures, which is neat. Since shields are based on max health, increasing your HP is more impactful with this ring than max shield bonuses. What really holds this ring back in my opinion is that it only grants mod power on shield gains. Say you proc Tightly Wound Coil over and over again. None of those shields past the first proc are going to generate mod power. Shields need to actively cover your health bar to be effective, and even then the mod power generated is still based off of your max HP. So not only do small sources of shield like the assorted 15% ones not grant much at all, they also need to run out their timers to generate more. I'd say let all shield generation proc the ring. If the percentage needs to be adjusted as a result of the change, then so be it. Targeting Jewel. Increases range on all firearms by 4 meters. Reduces spread by 15%. This is a ring I used to really like running back in the day, back when many weapons had shorter ideal ranges, and you only needed a bit more spread reduction to hit 100%. Nowadays, it's not really necessary. Not to say it's entirely worthless though. The 4 meters of extra range can help turn weapons like the double barrel into a pocket sniper. Although since the last major patch, pretty much every weapon received some kind of buff, including the actual pocket sniper, Sure Shot. Extra range can also be obtained via the prism system, as pitiful as the bonus is in that department. Much like Fey Shaman Ring, both aspects of this weapon are better found somewhere else. I'd suggest making the spread reduction 20% and adding on recoil reduction at the same percentage as well. It still wouldn't be amazing, but it would be slightly more enticing to players wanting a bit more control over high recoil weapons. Worn Admiral's Ring. All damage received is increased by 200%. All damage dealt is increased by 15%. The OG Challenge Ring. I don't have a ton to say about it. Every player's put it on at one point to feel like a badass, and then promptly took it off after dying to a single root hollow slap. Since this is a challenge ring, I won't suggest any changes for it. You could up the damage bonus if you really wanted to, and I wouldn't argue against it, but I also know there's a group of hardcore people who like the ring as it is. Wax Sealed Ring. Killing blows increase ranged and melee damage by 4% for 15 seconds, stacks 3 times. Like the other on-kill rings I mentioned in this tier, this ring stacks go away all at once. 12% ranged and melee damage is also not that great considering the competition. Make each stack give 7% and drain 1 at a time. Bringing it closer to Jewel of the Black Sun from Remnant 1 is probably the best way of buffing it. Fey Hunter Ring. Increases range of firearms by 35%. This ring is even more niche than Targeting Jewel. You might read the ring's effect and assume it's a percentage bonus to your total weapon range. Unfortunately, it only applies to your weapon's base ideal range. Since it's based off the base weapon range, the weapons that gain the most benefit from it are the Widowmaker and Monorail. Both weapons have a base ideal range of 35 meters, which makes the additional range provided by the ring 12.25 meters. This is just not worth it. Most boss fights will never see you facing a target more than 35 meters away, and since the ring's bonus scales with base range, weapons like the double barrel basically get nothing. If you need ideal range, just invest in Longshot. Fun fact, in order for this ring to give the same range buff as Longshot, the weapon needs to have an ideal range of at least 18 meters. About 60% of the weapons in the game meet or exceed that threshold. The other 40% would be getting more out of Longshot's flat increase. I think this ring needs a rework. We already have 2 other trinkets that increase effective range, and the fragments could be buffed up to be a higher flat amount or a percentage increase to make their existence less pitiful. I think this ring could be a reintroduction of Hunter's Band from Remnant 1. It could be a simple 10% ranged and weak spot damage boost. That would instantly be very good tier in my eyes. It'd be a ring I could definitely see myself and many other players running. Low yield recovery ring. Killing an enemy regenerates 6% of max health over 6 seconds. Additional kills increase duration by 6 seconds, max 30 seconds. Not only is this ring cursed by being an on-kill ring, it also provides a measly 1% life regen a second while it's active. It can stack up to 30 seconds, but if you wanted better healing and a damage boost for 30 seconds, you could just run Dran Scavenger Ring. This is another ring I'd completely redesign. And for this one, I'm gonna take a page out of Payday 2's book. If you've played it and used the Grinder perk deck, you'll have an idea of how it'll feel. My suggested rework would be to have this ring gain stacks by dealing ranged and melee damage. Stacks would cap out 5 and each have their own individual timer. Each stack would heal 0.4 health a second for 3 seconds. At 5 stacks, this would equate to 2 health a second so long as you keep up the damage. Triage would increase this to 3 health per second. At the very least, this rework would bring it to the same level as the other decent tier flat health regen rings. I also just really like the Grinder perk deck, and would love to have something similar to its effect in Remnant 2. Shiny Hog Lure. Reloading grants 25 to 50 mod power to both weapons based on percentage of magazine reloaded. This ring was made back during the time where Archon had double mod power generation. Now that it's shifted towards passive mod gen, this doesn't really work nearly as well with it. Even in non-Archon setups, the amount you get back from reloading is pitiful. You could just run a passive mod gen ring and have it affect both your weapons. By its design, it's always going to be at its strongest when using single shot weapons. And even then, it provides so little I can't really justify using it. I do like the idea of gaining mod power on reload, so I won't suggest a radical rework. I'll just say triple the ring's values. Getting 150 mod power per reload would actually make a difference when using some mods. Painless Obsidian. When Grey Health is present, gain haste and 1 stack of Bulwark. There are simply better sources of haste and Bulwark out there. Do you want this ring's effect without running it? Pop a Sweet Leaf and Light Extract. This is another ring I'd rework to be a more interesting Grey Health build pick. First off, I'd turn it into a Burden Ring, with the penalty being Grey Health now slowly drains over time. The upside would still provide haste, but it'd also improve the effectiveness of haste by 8% while Grey Health is present. This would make the action speed boost from haste 15%, or 18% with perception maxed out. This would be a huge speed buff to everything, but it'd only work when you have Grey Health. And now that it slowly drains over time, you'll need to find a way to maintain it. Obviously, there's a few rings that can manage this, Phantom Pain being a solid choice, especially in a half health setup. This rework would transform this ring from a nearly worthless Grey Health trinket to one of the most impactful ones in its class. Deep Pocket Ring. Increases ammo reserves by 35%. Now, 35% ammo reserves might sound decent on paper, and at the start of the game it can be good. However, with the addition of the Prism system, it's easy to gain 55% reserve ammo from the munitions fusion and single fragment. Not to mention the ammo reserve straight just gives 50% more ammo for 10 trade points. The final nail in the coffin is the ammo box. Players early on won't be able to afford many, of course, but once you're in the endgame, you'll have access to unlimited ammo. That's not to say this ring has no use in the endgame. It can help boost the Corrupted Cube Guns mod and make Provisioner Ring passively reload faster, which is kind of nice, but very much not needed. One interesting buff would be to add passive ammo regeneration while using the ring. This would actually improve its effectiveness in Provisioner swap setups. As for the regen value, I'm not entirely sure what to make it. The Engineer's Team perk provides a very small 0.25% ammo regen per second. It's honestly really bad. Like, might as well not even be there bad. Corrupted Cube Guns mod provides a bit over 1% per second. I think for this ring, the highest I would go is 2% a second. This would mean both of your weapons would be back at max ammo after 50 seconds. Considering Narud has 2 other trinkets that provide unlimited ammo, I think this is honestly fine. Transpose would become a really good combo with the ring. And if you also ran Gunfire Security Lanyard, you'd be reloading passively pretty fast. Maybe the ammo regen could be restricted to your stowed weapons if it were deemed too strong. At this point in Remnant 2's balancing though, it wouldn't be the craziest idea. Subterfuge link. After killing an enemy, increases the cast speed of next mod or skill cast by 35%, lasts 15 seconds or until consumed. This ring is very unnecessary. Flashcaster and Kinetic Cyclestone already provide a good amount of cast speed. It also doesn't work with Havoc form unless you get a kill during it, as the bonus gets consumed on skill activation. My suggested changes would be to keep it as a cast ring, but lean more into the idea of Subterfuge. The redesigned ring would be similar to Intimidating Presence from Challenger. On mod and skill cast, it'd apply Exposed to all enemies within 15 meters, as well as reduce their damage output by 10% for 10 seconds. Maybe this would be too much for one ring, but I really like the concept of compromising nearby targets' defenses and weaponry. Let me know what you think about this change in the comments though. Dense Silicon Ring. Gain 200% of health regenerated as mod power. This is yet another ring that sounds good on paper, but in execution feels lackluster. First off, it only generates mod power from healed missing health. If you're at full health and get healing from passive sources, skills, mods, or other allies,
You get nothing!
You must be missing health to gain the ring's benefit. Even when you do heal, you'll barely notice the effect. 200% conversion is a lot smaller than it seems. Let's say you have 150 health. If you were somehow able to set your health to 1 and then be healed up to full, you would only get 300 mod power, which is more than Power Leak from Archon gives, but it's also the absolute best case scenario. It's most effective with relic and skill healing. Passive healing grants so little that it's not even worth it. It's not nothing, it's not detrimental, but you'd be better off running any other mod-based ring. A solution to the ring's problems would be to allow non-restorative health to grant mod power at a 1-to-1 ratio, and then let missing health healed grant double or even triple the amount. No healing would ever be wasted, and you'd be rewarded more for actually restoring health. Assassin's Seal. Reduces enemy awareness range by 25%, increases all damage dealt to enemies not targeting the wearer by 10%. The ring's first effect is only really noticeable in the overworld. Outside of some bugs, detection range does not apply to boss fights. The damage bonus is only going to be helpful in co-op or in an invader build, and even then it's only a 10% damage bonus. There's no visual or audio cue letting you know it's working. You'll need to pay attention to your numbers, which in the heat of combat can be kind of a challenge. First of all, I'd personally add a little visual flair and sound effect to let you know the ring's actually working. I'd also up the damage bonus to 15%. I would suggest throwing on a threat reduction bonus as well, but I'm not fluent in how threat is generated, so I have no idea if it would do anything impactful. I know Invader's Relic perk has it, so I guess I'll find out eventually. Captain's Insignia. Increases revive speed and relic consume speed by 25% per downed or dead ally. Max 2 stacks. This is a better version of a terrible ring we'll get to soon. Being better than the worst doesn't mean it's worth using. As we'll discuss later, there are multiple ways of reviving your allies via revivalist and archetype skills and perks that are far easier and safer to work with. I think the main effect can stay, but there should be something else to entice you to use it. To lean more into the medic playstyle, I'll add a new effect that'll be applied to you or your allies upon reviving them or being revived yourself. The buff name would be Captain's Protection. It would provide a 10% DR buff and 3% health regen bonus for 10 seconds. This effect would be applied via any form of revival, not just by relic. This change would make it a ring worthy of being worn by a captain. Tear of Kayula. Increases relic capacity by 2 while equipped. This ring is pretty good in the early game, doubly so in hardcore runs. However, as you hit the mid to late game, it drops off hard. It can give you one more use with Enlarged Heart, but if you're running that relic, you're confident you'll be able to beat your encounters in 5 uses or less. With Medic existing and the combination of Emergency Switch and Conservation Seal providing access to unlimited relic charges, this ring really has zero purpose being run later on. It took me a little while, but I think I've come up with a cool addition that could retain its effectiveness in the early game and make it a fun relic use trinket at all game stages. Since it's based off of Kayula, and the Invoker skill by the same name summons lightning bolts to strike nearby targets, I think this ring could have a mini Way of Kayula effect to all targets within 15 meters. It would be like Detonating Cord, but instead of a close range blast, it'd summon a lightning bolt to all nearby targets. The damage would scale from 100 to 300 depending on your power level. This would make the ring even stronger in the early game, but come on, you can't deny it'd be really cool. Suppression Ward. Prevents Suppression Blight. I'm gonna go ahead and talk about all 3 of these rings here at the same time, because they all help with a similar problem. That problem being blights. Each one of these rings prevents you from being afflicted by their associated debuff in the few boss fights or enemy encounters that utilize them. Outside of those situations, however, there's no point in running them. It doesn't help that both Alchemist and Ritualist can easily turn off blights by just using the resistance consumables. Hell, even average players can hit 75 blight res or more by using all 3 at the same time. My suggestion would be to combine all 3 rings into one, and then make the other 2 their own rings, or honestly remove them. We have way too many rings in this game as it is, and as much as I like discussing reworks and buffs to existing options, there's a point where keeping track of everything becomes an arduous task, which is what I think happened with a lot of these rings as balance patches and DLCs came out. Hex Ward. Prevents Curse. I'd make this ring an alternative to Atonement Fold. It'd give you one permanent stack of Curse, removing 10% of your health, and in return increase your elemental and status effect damage by 15% each. I'd also rename it to Hexing Sigil. Rot Ward. Prevents Root Rot Blight. Like the previous ring, I'd rework this one to be another alternative to Atonement Fold. I'd call it Band of Rot. It would afflict the user with permanent Root Fog, the status from the Infested Abyss. This would deal 2 damage a second and remove Grey Health like Erosion does. In return, you'd gain 20 passive mod power generation a second, and an additional 7.5% mod power generated from all sources. Root Fog would need to be added to the list of compatible negative status effects for sources like Embrace of Shahala and Nightweaver's Grudge, but I can totally see players running this in riskier Archon setups. Galvanized Resupply Band. Increases ammo pickups by 100%. Double ammo pickups can be really nice early on before you can afford ammo boxes. However, you need to go out of your way to complete the dungeon and then find at least 3 caches. Not to mention, you might just stumble across Zero Divide and then never need to worry about ammo ever again. It can be used with Transpose and either the Shovel or Archetype perks to make ammo pickups return even more, which is about the only thing keeping me from placing this in Terrible. One effect I would add to the ring would be increasing the player's fire rate by 10% for 15 seconds after grabbing an ammo pack or using an ammo box. Bitter Memento. Forces 1% of wearer's max health to remain as Grey Health. Activating a skill converts 33.5% of max health into Grey Health. Conversion cannot kill wearer. The forced Grey Health aspect can actually help proc sources that only need it to be present to activate. Outside of that though, this ring is really underwhelming. The health converted on skill activation is clearly meant to work with Necklace of Flowing Life, but there are far better sources of conversion out there, like Reprocessed Heart, Mystery Jerky, and Burden of the Warlock. Unless you also invest into skill cooldown or use faster recharging skills, that aspect isn't going to come into play very often. I don't really know why they added this part to the ring. They could have done so much more. I would make this ring the inverse of Ring of Phantom Pain, and have it convert your health to Grey Health over time, like the previously mentioned Reprocessed Heart and Mystery Jerky. This change would make it function far better with Necklace of Flowing Life, while still retaining the 1% permanent Grey Health for the few trinkets that want it. Sage Stone. Increases earned experience by 10%. Some players may consider this ring far better than I. It does have its place in the Prism grind. Beyond that though, this ring provides nothing. And even then, I'd still rather run this than any of the rings down below. I don't know if I'd honestly change this ring. Maybe its XP bonus could be buffed, and for good measure, maybe you could also throw on a bonus 25% scrap pickup. Perhaps it could be changed to convert extra experience to scrap when you aren't leveling anything. Now it's time for the bottom of the barrel, in all of its mud-tooth stew-covered grossness. Lodestone Ring. Increases all damage dealt against illuminated enemies by 5%. Just use Stone of Balance. Moving on, we have... I'll actually talk about it, albeit briefly. This ring requires you to wear one specific piece of headgear, and be within 7 to 8 meters to apply the damage bonus. This is just bad on so many levels. The distance at which enemies are considered illuminated is smaller than Challenger's effective range. That should not be a thing. It should be the same if not more. And then the damage bonus? I'd honestly say just triple it. 5% is so minimal, you might as well not even have it. A terrible reward for what is otherwise a pretty cool secret unlock. Booster Ring. Increases all status resistances by 25. This ring was buffed a while back, and it's still terrible, mainly due to the fact that there's not really that many enemies that deal elemental damage or blight buildup in the first place. You can just pop the 1 or more resistance consumables you'll need for the fight, or, you know, use one of the 3 rings that turns off blights. If you're running Alchemist or Ritualist, those consumable resistances are increased even more via their perks. The absolute best use case for this ring is probably Boss Rush, mainly in the mobbing sections against enemies that do actually have various forms of elemental damage and blight buildup, primarily from aberrations since they can have elemental damage via their modifiers. Even still, you can just pop one of every resistance consumable before and during the run. I'd say if the elemental dots in Remnant 2 had build-up bars like some did in Remnant 1, this ring would be a tad bit better. Maybe this ring could give a temporary buff like Tempest Conduit does when being hit by elemental or blight sources. What that buff would be, I have no clue. Thalos Islet. Grants 1 stack of Bulwark, and 2 stamina regen per second for each Bulwark stack. Increases Bulwark maximum stacks to 6. This ring is Omega Bait. The 6th stack of Bulwark only gives 2% DR, and since this ring is the only way to increase the stack cap to 6, it tricks you into running it with the other rings whose effects scales per stack of Bulwark, but it's not worth it for any of them. Maybe if hitting 6 stacks gave a substantial bonus to any of them, it'd be worth it, but instead we're left with this sad excuse for a bulwark trinket. The stamina regen bonus might as well not even be there. It's so meager. The recovery trait alone gives 30 regen a second. I'd rather this ring improve Bulwark's DR effectiveness by 2% at each tier. At least then it'd be a more impactful option. Band. Increases speed of revive and being revived by 35%. Increases downed health and downed movement speed by 100%. If Remnant 2 had a PvP mode, this would be up there for that tier list. Unfortunately though, we live in a world where we have Fragments, Revivalist, Teamwork, Bonded, Redemption, Elixir of Life, even Captain's Insignia for crying out loud, and that ring's not even good. My point is, if you need a way to revive or be revived, there's plenty of better options out there. The increased downed health is kind of nice. It can give your allies a bit more time to revive you in the heat of combat. The bonus movement speed is a little noticeable, but it would have to be way higher to be anywhere near worth it. My suggestion for this ring would be to remove the ability to die when downed, no bleed out, and no damage taken from enemies or allies. This change alone would bump it up at least one tier in my mind. Also, make the crawl speed bonus 200 or even 300% faster. If you wear this ring, you should be able to crawl your ass over to your allies, or at the very least get to cover so that you can be revived eventually. Would this need testing? Maybe, although it wouldn't make your team suddenly unkillable, as if everyone goes down, it's still game over. Pan Warband. Increases movement speed and reload speed by 3% and fire rate by 2% for each ally wearing this ring. If you want one or more of these stats at a decent value, use any of the rings I've mentioned above. This ring is so sad. The absolute best this ring provides is a 9% faster reload and move speed bonus and a 6% bonus fire rate. Just use haste. It alone boosts all three of these, plus a ton of other stats by 7% or more depending on the rest of your build. My fix for this ring would be to give it a base of 5% to all three stats, and then grant an additional 5% per player also wearing it. It would give a full team 15% faster movement speed, reload speed, and fire rate. That would make it a worthwhile commitment. Would it become one of the best options for team play? Yeah, probably. At the same time, it's not hard to make OP builds as it is, so this change being implemented wouldn't really change that much in the landscape of Remnant 2 balance. Force Multiplier. Overcharging charge weapons grants 1.05 times weapon damage per 0.5 seconds while charging is held beyond perfect release window, max 1.3 times. 3 seconds is way too long to make this effect worth it. Being a multiplicative bonus, you'd think at the very least it'd be decent, but in actuality, no. You'd be better off using any other range damage ring and messing up the perfect shot timing. My suggestion would be to make the overcharge time 1.25 to 1.5 seconds, and make the bonus 1.4 times more damage. This would give you a choice when using weapons with perfect charge mechanics. Do you go for the faster perfect shots, or spend a little over a second to gain a noticeable bump in per shot damage? This would have to be tested of course, but I believe it would be a nice buff to what is otherwise a pretty terrible ring. Drazier Sniper Sigil. Increases the minimum damage at max fall-off range from 20% to 40%. This ring is really bad. Fall-off range is already a hyper niche stat to buff, and this only brings the minimum value to 40%. This is just awful. For it to be any good, it'd need to be at least 80% minimum. This would give players an interesting choice of investing for that perfect amount of ideal weapon range via trinkets like Targeting Jewel, Rangefinder, and Longshot, or just using this ring and having basically unlimited range, but at the cost of 20% less damage. This ring would be pretty mutually exclusive with the other range buffing sources. It'd still be kinda niche outside of some pretty funny situations, like the double barrel sniping Naru drones from miles away. This has always been one of the worst rings in my mind since launch, and I kinda can't believe it's never been buffed. Last, and certainly the absolute least, Wood Ring. Increases stagger damage by 15%. Finally, the absolute worst ring in Remnant 2. This basically does nothing. Remnant 2 doesn't have a viewable stagger bar like Sekiro. Stagger damage needs to be increased by huge amounts for it to mean anything. And I'm not saying this ring needs to be buffed to be like 200%. I think it needs a rework. Here's what I would do. I'd make it simply increase your evade distance by 25%, and then maybe add in a 20% stamina cost reduction. The secondary effect could be static, or it could be a reward for perfect dodging. Bam! Now you have another Dark Souls reference by having a wood ring that buffs your dodge rolls. And there we have it. All 225 rings in Remnant 2, ranked, discussed, everything. At least in my opinion. Like I said from the start, this video is probably going to cause a lot of discussion. There's undoubtedly going to be some disagreements about where I placed some rings. I've absolutely 100% missed some things. With 225 rings, there's no way one person could get literally everything. There's probably bugs I missed, maybe something hidden or unmentioned somewhere that I had no clue about. I implore you to leave a comment down below. Whatever it is, you know, your thoughts, your opinions, maybe you just want to gush about a certain ring you like, maybe you think I'm insane for some of my rankings, but that's the real main purpose of this video. I want to have discussions. As for some final thoughts, this game has too many rings in it. I was kind of excited with the first and second DLC, but as we got towards the third DLC, the sheer quantity undoubtedly led to a lot of rings getting neglected or overlooked over the course of the game's year of balancing. Hopefully in Remnant 3, if we ever get it, they take a step back in terms of the quantity of rings. I'm glad we have 4 slots now, however, I would rather we have less total rings if it meant the rings that we did get were more impactful to our builds. The amount of rings in the lower half of Decent and below kinda shows how unimpactful a lot of the rings are in this game. In the first game, damage bonuses were multiplicative with your armor damage bonuses, meaning that the damage you gained from rings, necklaces, and traits were far more impactful. In Remnant 2, everything is pretty much additive. Most of the damage in your build is going to come from your archetypes. The next best source of damage is crits, because of course they are. They multiply the amount of damage you deal. For a very common example, when your archetypes are giving you 65% more range damage, an extra 10, 12, even 15% isn't going to be that impactful. When critical hits can give you 50% or way more damage, yeah, it's no wonder why players generally prefer them. There's a lot more I want to say, but I'll keep that for my Remnant 2 retrospective video. If you're at the end hearing this, I just want to say thank you. This part's not scripted. I just wanted to thank all of you for sticking around with me for these past 12 months. I know I haven't put out a ton of videos this year, but hopefully going into 2025, we can change that. I do still have a lot of videos in the pipeline. I am so sorry this video took this long to come out. Originally, this was going to be a more freestyle type video, but as I got further into the recording, I realized I wasn't super comfortable talking about a lot of the rings in this game. Like, I thought I knew everything, but as I tried forming thoughts on some of them, I realized I don't know enough. So I went back, I spent like a month using all the rings, and as I started using every single ring, I went back to my tier list, which I had already kind of had a general layout for, but then I realized this really shouldn't be here, this should be up here or down here. This isn't as effective as I thought it was, this is more effective than I thought it was. This ring is better than this one, but this ring is actually bugged, or this ring has this issue, or this ring is outclassed, this ring's overpowered, etc. So I went back and did a lot of rewriting, a lot of adjusting to the tier list. It's a lot different now from its first iteration, and while I did go a little insane writing over 20,000 words of a script, I did still enjoy making this video. So if you enjoyed this and want to see me do tier lists for the other aspects of Remnant 2, let me know down in the comments. I don't think anything else would be nearly this detailed, just because, you know, there's like a little over 100 necklaces. There's only like 60 something weapons off the top of my head. Mutators wouldn't be as bad. Relics would be pretty easy. Concoctions would be like a 2-minute video. Let me know. Was this enjoyable, or would you rather me focus on my other forms of content? For now, I'm gonna go to bed. This is Rye. Have a good night, everyone.